Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My childhood home in rural Tennessee bore the stigma of a troubled past. Many deaths had occurred there before my family moved in. The last tenants, those who rented it from my mother and stepfather, had fled the premises after their son decided to end his life. And before that, the house had been the scene of several murders. We didn't know the details, but that's what the owners had told us. I was still young when my mother met my stepfather, and shortly after, they decided to move in together. I didn't experience anything abnormal until my little sister arrived, whom we'll call Bait. That's when everything shifted. The house only had 2 bedrooms, so I had to share mine with Bait. She cried constantly, and at my young age, I could barely tolerate it. But I remember one particular night when she had cried for hours, until suddenly she fell silent. Turning toward her crib, I saw a dark silhouette leaning over her. It barely moved, but when it did, its movements were slow and terrifying. Terrified, I took refuge under my covers and eventually fell asleep like that. The next morning, when I told my parents what I had seen, they dismissed it as simply the fruit of my imagination. But the scene repeated itself many times. I would wake up and the silhouette would be there, always near the crib, never elsewhere in the room. After constant complaints, my parents finally moved me into their bedroom with my mother, while my stepfather now slept in mine. But the phenomena didn't stop there. Shortly after the first appearances, my stepfather lost his job. He who had always been a hard worker, this news plunged my mother into great perplexity. He sank into deep depression. He sincerely loved his work, and this loss seemed to break something in him. I saw him spending days on the couch without moving, eyes riveted to the television screen. One day, coming home from school, I found him installed like that, and behind him, that dark silhouette, frozen behind the couch. I remember every detail as if it were engraved in my memory. Distraught, I started crying, and he took me to my room to calm me down. That evening, I spoke about it again to my parents. My stepfather remained indifferent, and my mother seemed exasperated. Once again, no one believed me. After a few weeks of respite followed by a gradual return of the presence, it now seemed to roam, sometimes near Bait, sometimes around my stepfather. The rare nights when I slept in my room, I heard a voice, a woman's voice coming from Bait's crib, speaking to her in a low voice. I never could understand what she was saying, but it chilled my blood. As Bait grew up, learning to walk and talk, I saw her spending long hours discussing in that room with her friend. My parents weren't alarmed by this, seeing it simply as an imaginary friend, but I knew exactly what it was about. The longer this entity lingered in the house, the darker emotions became. Bait was distant, withdrawn into her world. My mother seemed prey to constant anger. My stepfather had become the shadow of himself, and I felt desperately alone. Then the argument started. Every evening, screams erupted. My mother reproached my stepfather for not managing to keep a job, and he was nothing more than a heap of sadness. Their quarrels only got worse. One night, I even heard my stepfather beg my mother to put down the knife. But the worst happened one evening while I had lingered in front of the television in the living room. It wasn't very late, maybe 8:30 p.m. My stepfather was sleeping on the couch, and my mother had already gone to her room. Seized by fatigue in turn, I turned off the television and went upstairs to my room. Arriving upstairs, I heard whispers, then Bates' voice responding. The door, slightly open a few inches, revealed a scene that froze me. Bates stood near the silhouette as if it was trying to take her somewhere. I let out a cry, and the door slammed violently before my eyes. I remained frozen, screaming and crying until my mother rushed precipitously from her room. Unable to say a word, I just pointed at the door. She tried to open it, but it was locked. It was only a cheap lock, so she managed with her nail to turn it and push the door open. Bates stood in a corner of the room, facing the wall. My mother scolded her for locking the door, even though she was too small to even reach the handle. Yet Bates didn't react at all to the scolding. From that moment on, I sank into deep melancholy, just like the rest of the family it seemed. No one spoke to each other anymore. No one took the trouble to ask me how I was doing. I became the one who took care of my little sister, me, and this strange entity. I got used to it in a way. It even began to appear near my bed on nights when sadness crushed me more, and strangely, its presence comforted me. It reminded me that I wasn't totally alone. Finally, my mother, at the end of her rope, decided to leave my stepfather, and we went to take refuge with my grandparents. I remember her ordering us to pack our bags. And as we got into the car, I saw the silhouette one more time near my stepfather. A feeling of sadness overwhelmed me at the idea of leaving him behind, but at least he wouldn't be truly alone. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I've only shared my story with my wife and a few close friends. It dates back to when I was assigned as a radio operator in the Army during the Vietnam War, and it remains etched in my memory to this day. I was a young draftee fresh out of high school, inexperienced and ignorant of all the realities of the conflict. I didn't know what awaited me or the true reasons for this war, but I knew deep down that I had a duty to my fellow soldiers. We arrived on a Friday evening, packed into buses that drove us to our barracks. The air was heavy, saturated with humidity, and the ground was soaked by a recent storm. I remember precisely the journey and that fetid smell, similar to that of sewers. The first night was calm, without incident, but a dull tension reigned, fueled by the sinister stories of our instructors during basic training. I still see that crescent moon that appeared timidly between the clouds, while we were all there joking to deceive fear. Not being good at making people laugh, I simply listened to the others who were more talkative. My mission was to ensure communications between my unit and other detachments, so that everyone was informed of the situation across the entire terrain. I carried on my back a cumbersome device, as radios were at the time, accompanied by a multitude of other equipment. I was quickly assigned to a tight-knit unit led by the recent loss of their radio operator, victim of a mine. I remember with troubling acuity our first contact with the enemy. The gunfire was deafening, the loudest I've ever heard. We were in a dense part of the jungle, blinded by enemy fire that we couldn't locate. We threw ourselves to the ground, returning fire blindly. The The tumult seemed like an eternity, although the exchange probably didn't exceed a few minutes. We then advanced to secure the area, and that was the first time I saw the enemy up close. 3 Viet Cong soldiers lay in a pool of blood. I couldn't believe that these inert bodies had been breathing, talking just moments before, probably young men, perhaps brothers, sons, friends. They were probably just resting, carefree before our arrival, and there they lay, deprived of all life. But despite everything, I felt a form of justification. They were the enemy, and if we hadn't fired, it would be our bodies they would have trampled. A few days later, we were redeployed to a more dangerous area where losses were heavier and reinforcement needs more pressing. I was gradually getting used to the violence, witnessing the agony of many of our young comrades. One day, my non-commissioned officer informed me that someone wanted to speak to me. A man in his 50s with a stranger face approached me. He radiated a quiet, calculated authority, almost unsettling, and even my superior officer seemed reduced to silence before him. He introduced himself as Frederick Douglas, an intelligence officer based nearby, and announced that I was now assigned to his unit as a radio operator. I was attached to my unit. I would have liked to stay with them, but orders are not discussed. So I got into a helicopter and left with him. We landed in a wooded area near ruined Viet Cong huts. The place still bore the stigma of a recent confrontation. You could feel the tension embedded in the landscape. Masked men equipped with gas filters wandered here and there, while others, impassive, seemed indifferent to my presence. The atmosphere was strange, almost unreal, and these soldiers had neither the evasive look nor the fear in their belly that I had learned to recognize in ours. I even tried to engage in conversation with some of them, but all I got in return was an empty look, devoid of any emotion, as if they were contaminated by something unspeakable. Whatever this thing was, they were all affected by it, and this plunged me into deep uneasiness. Officer Douglas and I entered one of the most modest huts, and I was asked to stay there until someone came to get me. I should have obeyed and waited patiently, but curiosity mixed with dull anxiety prevented me from staying in place. I then approached the main hut, and taken by an irrepressible need to understand, I risked a glance inside. What I saw chilled my blood like never before. On a makeshift table lay 6 murky containers, each containing the severed head of a guerrilla fighter from which emerged wires and tubes like sinister appendages. A green liquid seemed to interact with the human remains. The lips trembled, the eyelids quivered, as if these faces still belonged to a world between life and death. Suddenly, a hand was placed on my shoulder. It was Intelligence Officer Douglas, and his face betrayed deep anger. In a low, almost pleading voice, I asked him what he was doing in there, but he answered me dryly that I should never have entered before sending me back to my hut with a sharp tone. We must have been attacked shortly after, or something serious happened, because I woke up a day later in a makeshift infirmary with several broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, without the slightest memory of the events that followed. I never saw Officer Frederick Douglas again, nor any of those soldiers, if that was his real name. I often find myself thinking back to what he could have been doing there. Maybe he was trying to extract information from enemy corpses. Whatever the case, this strange and disturbing experience will forever remain etched in my memory. I'm a big solo traveler. My friends are generally too busy or don't have the means to constantly fly off to 1,000 destinations, so I often go alone. I took a flight to San Diego. It was my first time there solo. I had already visited most of California's major cities, except San Diego, which I absolutely wanted to cross off my to-do list. I stayed at a decent hotel located just steps from downtown. When checking in, I met a man in the lobby who was a bit older than me. He struck up a conversation, asking where I was from, how long I planned to stay, and if I'd been there before. It was apparently his second visit, and he was also traveling alone. He offered to help carry my suitcases to my room since he was going upstairs. I accepted, touched by his kindness. He carried my bags to the elevator, then we went to the third floor. He set my suitcases down in front of my room door, wished me a good stay, and disappeared down the hallway. I thanked him one last time before entering my room. I put my things on the bed and lay down for a moment to take a short nap. Once rested, I went back down to the lobby, ready to go out, when the receptionist called out to me. She asked me what that man had done when he came up with me. I replied that he had simply helped me carry my bags. She then warned me that he had been seen lurking around the hotel for a while and had entered just after me. She thought he wasn't staying at the hotel and advised me to be wary of him if he reappeared. This information obviously troubled me. I hoped she was wrong and that he was simply a well-meaning man, but out of caution, I decided to follow her recommendations. I went out to explore the city and had a beautiful day. A few hours later, I returned to the hotel to change before dinner. Another employee was then at the reception. In my room, I took a quick shower, changed clothes, then lay down for another nap. That's when I heard knocking at the door, followed by a man's gentle voice saying, "Housekeeping." I hadn't requested anything, and it was only my first day. I thought it might be a room mix-up. I looked through the peephole, but there was no one in the hallway. This was strange, to say the least. Immediately, the image of that man came back to mind. What if it was him? I ignored the knocking and called reception to ask if they had sent someone. They, of course, answered no. I then asked them to send someone to my room for security reasons. 5 minutes later, a housekeeper knocked. I calmly explained the situation to her and thanked her for coming. I then left for dinner. After the meal, I took a nighttime tour of the city's lively districts, illuminated by lights. I returned around 10 p.m. I spoke to the person at reception to tell them what had happened earlier with this man. I suspected of trying to pose as room service staff to enter my room. I asked if anyone matching his description had been spotted. She replied no. To reassure me, she even checked the surveillance camera on my floor, and there had been no one in the hallway. I thanked her, then went upstairs and headed to my room. I removed my clothes, slipped into bed, and turned on the television to fall asleep listening to something. In less than an hour, I was gently drifting off to sleep, the sounds of the TV mixing with my dreams, gradually transforming in my mind. I sighed when I heard a door close. This integrated into my dream. I didn't really wake up until I felt the mattress sink under a foreign weight on the other side of the bed. Turning around, I saw a man wearing a black COVID mask and a baseball cap climbing onto the bed, reaching his hand toward me. He grabbed me, trying to strangle me by covering my mouth to prevent me from screaming. but I managed to struggle long enough to scream with all my might. He continued trying to silence me, but I fought with determination until someone started knocking at the door. I screamed for help, and at that moment, the man probably understood that the situation was turning to his disadvantage. He released me, opened the door, and violently pushed away the woman who was knocking before fleeing down the hallway toward the stairs. The woman entered, upset, to make sure I was okay while I was in shock, overwhelmed by tears. Other guests from neighboring rooms came out to understand what was happening. Several staff members also arrived, and the police were called. According to the hotel's video recordings, the man had somehow gotten hold of a master key that allowed him to enter my room. His mask and cap concealed his face, but I'm convinced it was the man who had helped me carry my bags on the first day. I'm persuaded he wanted to discover which room I was staying in so he could return later. It's terrifying to imagine that he could have succeeded in this kind of assault with another victim. I did my best to enjoy the rest of my stay, although this experience will probably haunt me for life. The hotel fully refunded my stay and assigned me another room. In hindsight, I probably should have pursued legal action against the establishment. The hotel, of course, handed over all the surveillance footage to law enforcement. I was never contacted again to identify anyone, which sadly suggests this man was never formally identified or arrested. I know there are people who don't believe in these things, and honestly, until recently, I was one of those people. I always heard stories from down south with that air of folklore, like grandmother's tales to scare children. But what happened after Grandpa Ezekiel died was different. It was real, and to this day, I can't explain it. My grandfather was a faith healer, one of those who blessed people with their eyes closed, rosary wrapped around their hands, mouth murmuring words that nobody understood quite right. He lived on an isolated farm in rural Alabama, and for as long as I can remember, I heard people say he had a gift, that he was respected, but that you also shouldn't mess with his things. But after he passed, we ended up doing exactly the opposite. It was partly our fault. We went through his closets, messed with his boxes, and found something that looked like a piece of purple cloth tied with black thread. It was heavy, kind of stiff inside. We thought it was a keepsake, maybe a talisman of his, and we hung it on the living room wall. That's when everything started spiraling out of control. The strangest thing is that at first, everything was calm. We thought it was beautiful, The cloth was embroidered, had an antique look to it. You could even think it was some kind of remembrance from a promise or something religious. My aunt even commented, "Oh, it must have been a gift from someone he healed." Nobody questioned it much. We hung the charm on a nail that was already in the living room wall, right next to the image of Saint Sebastian. That wall always had Grandpa's things, a picture of the Sacred Heart, a ribbon from our Lord of Good End, some old photos. So nobody thought it was strange to put one more item there. But now, thinking back, the energy of that thing was different. It didn't fit with the rest. The house still has my grandmother, my mother, and the dog that belonged to Grandpa Jockey, an old mutt but faithful to his soul. And Jockey was the first to find the charm strange. On the same day we hung that thing up, he stopped entering the living room. He would stand at the door, looking up with his tail between his legs and a low whimper that I'd never heard come out of him before. It seemed like fear, but it was quiet fear, contained, like he recognized something and knew he couldn't mess with it. And the most bizarre thing, nobody noticed this right away. It was only later that my grandmother spoke up in that calm way of hers. "That dog doesn't want to go in there anymore. He's seeing something, I bet." That's when we started paying closer attention. But there's a detail that won't leave my head to this day. On the third day after they hung up the charm, my mother went to sweep the living room early in the morning. Something she does every day, always at the same time, before coffee. And when she touched the broom near the wall where the purple cloth was, the broom simply broke in half. But it broke clean, like someone had kicked it. The top part fell one way, the bottom the other way, and she just stood there staring, not understanding anything. At the time, we laughed. I even said it was an old broom, rotten wood, those things. But when I picked up the pieces to throw them away, I saw that the wood was whole inside, no bugs, no cracks. And the strangest thing was that the handle looked burned from the inside, a dark brown, kind of crumbly, like wet ash. And there couldn't have been fire. There wasn't even a candle lit nearby. After that, the house started feeling different. In the afternoon, the living room got darker than normal, even with the sun hitting the window. And it wasn't shadow. It was like the light didn't want to enter that corner, like the cloth was pulling it inside. I know it sounds like an exaggeration, but anyone who walked through there noticed. Everyone started talking quieter, like they were inside an empty church. And it wasn't because of mourning, it was something else. Jockey kept refusing to enter, and then my grandmother started saying she was feeling breathing behind her in the middle of the night, like someone was touching the back of her neck while she made coffee in the dark. And she's not one to make up stories. From then on, nobody wanted to sweep near that wall anymore. The bizarre thing is that after that, everything started happening at once. It wasn't just the dog being scared or the living room being dark anymore. Things inside the house started breaking by themselves. Pots that were quiet in the cabinet would fall out of nowhere. Once we heard a huge crash in the kitchen, and when we ran to see, the milk pitcher was on the floor, dented like someone had thrown it hard. There was a day when I was alone in the living room reading on the couch, and I heard a dry sound, like a crack. When I looked toward the corner of the wall, I saw that the cloth, that purple cloth, had changed position. Before it was hanging to one side, but now it was straight, stretched out like someone had pulled the ends and adjusted it. And there was nobody there, no wind, nothing. And the worst part, the cloth started dripping. I swear on everything, one drop, very slowly, dripping from the bottom tip. It wasn't water. It was thicker, kind of dark. It dripped right onto the floor, and I was paralyzed, watching that like time had stopped. I could only move when my grandmother came into the living room, asking if I had left the stove on. That night nobody slept right. The house got hot, stuffy, even with the window open and the fan on. My mother said she had a nightmare about Grandpa Zeke, but that he wasn't the way we remembered him. She said he was turned away in the dark and just kept repeating one thing quietly. That wasn't supposed to have been hung up. And that's when she said straight out, "There's something wrong with that cloth." The strangest thing was that night we decided to hold a vigil. Everyone was already exhausted. Nobody could sleep right. My grandmother was walking through the rooms like she was hearing things, and the dog had simply disappeared into the woods for 2 days. So my aunt, who's more devout, decided we needed to light candles and pray like they used to do in the old days when someone died with unfinished business. We turned off all the lights in the house and stayed with just the candles lit around the living room, some on top of the entertainment center, others on the floor near the cloth. My mother brought Grandpa's rosary, my aunt lit sage incense, and Grandma stayed murmuring a prayer quietly that I'd never heard before. The house seemed trapped in a thick silence. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was like a weight, like the air was denser. And then the healer arrived. We called her from the neighboring town, an old woman well known around there. When she came through the gate, she didn't even go up the porch steps. She looked at the living room through the window and stood still, just staring at the cloth. After a few seconds, she said a sentence that made everyone shiver. That there isn't the soul of a dead person. That's something trapped, something that shouldn't have been messed with. We called her to come in. She shook her head and just said, "Y'all hung up a curse." And at that exact moment, one of the candles went out by itself. Just that one, the one that was closest to the cloth. The worst of all is that after that day, everything stopped. Simply stopped. Nobody did anything. The healer didn't come in, didn't bless, didn't pray. She just left. She said she didn't mess with things tied in cloth, because whoever does that kind of work knows very well what they're doing, and it wasn't her place to undo it. We stood there, not knowing what to do, waiting for some sign, but nothing happened. That night, the candle that went out didn't light again, and nobody had the courage to touch the cloth. It stayed hanging there just like it always had, but now it seemed more present, like it occupied more space than before. It was just looking at it that made your stomach turn. Nobody used the living room anymore. We started squeezing into the kitchen, taking mattresses to the porch, making up excuses not to walk by. The house fell into silence inside, but it was that silence that doesn't let you rest. My grandmother started walking around with a charm around her neck and coarse salt in her apron pocket. She said the breathing behind her still appeared, but now it came with a whisper, and it was Grandpa's voice. But even with all this, we didn't take the charm down. Nobody had the courage. To this day, it's there. It's been about 8 months now, and since that day, the house has been like it entered mourning again. It's not the same anymore. The energy changed. It's like the thing settled in, like it found the right place to stay. And the strange thing is that even with everything, we got used to it. And the most bizarre thing is that after a while, we stopped commenting on the cloth. Nobody talks about it anymore, doesn't even look much at the wall. But nobody takes it down either. It seems like it became part of the house, like it took root there. Sometimes I wonder if Grandpa left that there on purpose, you know. Like it was a lock, a seal, and we unknowingly tore what we shouldn't have. Because deep down, as much as he was a man of faith, he was also full of secrets. He had things he kept and didn't tell anyone. And if that was meant to protect or to imprison something, the truth is I have no idea what was inside that cloth. And to be honest, I don't want to know either. I just know that since it appeared, the house changed, and we learned to live with whatever came with it. But sometimes, late at night when the house creaks and settles, I can't help but wonder what my grandfather was trying to keep locked away. And whether hanging that cloth on our wall was the biggest mistake we ever made. Because if there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that some things are meant to stay buried. Some secrets are kept for a reason, and some cloths should never be untied. Okay, maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe it's just a childhood memory distorted by time. But I still catch myself thinking about it more than I'd like to. Clara, my sister, was 7 years old when she got that doll. One of those big ones, about the same size as her, with similar hair, similar clothes. It was a gift from a cousin of our mother's, one of those who shows up out of nowhere and disappears for years. The doll came with the strangest phrase in the world. She's to keep you company, that's it. No happy birthday, no note, nothing. At the time, Clara loved it. I thought it was kind of tacky, but kids that age love anything that looks like them. We lived in a simple house in small-town Montana, and our mom took care of everything by herself. I was older, about 13, and I was always thinking these things were silly. A doll is just a toy, I thought. But there's one detail, and I swear I remember this like it was yesterday. On the first day the doll arrived, our dog wouldn't enter Clara's room anymore. The strangest thing is that Thor, our German Shepherd mix, was attached to Clara. He'd been sleeping at the foot of her bed since he was a puppy. But the day that doll showed up, he froze at the doorway and started growling low. That growl that's not about fighting, but about warning. The kind that sounds more like advice than a threat. Clara tried to pull him by the collar, crying, but it didn't work. And the doll was just sitting there in the corner of the room, with those stiff legs stretched out, and its face tilted to the side, like it was listening to everything. My mom said it was just jealousy, that dogs feel these things. But the following week, he started urinating in the hallway, always in the same spot, right in front of Clara's bedroom door. And look, he was house-trained. He'd never done that before. I remember once I was running through there at night, coming back from the bathroom, and I swear I heard something dragging in her room. It wasn't the sound of a bed or toys. It was something heavier, like a shoe scraping on the wooden floor. But when I opened the door, Clara was sleeping, and so was the doll. Except there was one detail, it wasn't in the corner anymore. It was next to the bed, standing up, leaning against the wall. I know it might sound silly, kids move toys around, right? But Clara never did that. She was methodical, had a habit of lining up her toys. The doll had its place, as she said, always leaning in the corner, sitting with its dress arranged. Never standing up, never near the bed. But after that day, every night I noticed the doll appeared in a different spot. Once it was sitting in Clara's reading chair, looking directly at the door. Another time it was turned toward the window, kind of tilted to the side. And the worst part was when my mom said she thought I was messing with it just to scare Clara. But I wasn't even going into that room alone anymore. Seriously, there was something in the air, a weight, like when the house is completely silent and you still feel like someone's watching you. And it wasn't childhood paranoia. It was more physical than psychological. It even gave me pressure in my ears. The bizarre thing was when Clara started talking to the doll like really talking, not just pretend. She would whisper, and when we asked what it was, she'd just say, she asked for a secret. The first time Clara said that, I thought she was just playing. But she said it looking very serious, with that gentle voice kids have when they don't know what they're saying, but at the same time seem to know more than they should. She looked at me and said, "She knows when you're mad at me." I asked who she was, pretending I didn't know, and Clara just pointed with her chin. The doll was sitting on the rug, kind of crooked, with its arms stretched forward like it had been dropped in the middle of a hug that nobody wanted to finish. The truth is that Clara started changing after the doll arrived. Before, she was super affectionate, loving, hugged me all the time. Afterward, she became more withdrawn. And there was one night, this I remember with a knot in my chest, when she woke me up in the middle of the night, poking me, and said quietly, "She doesn't like you here." So I lost sleep. I got up, went to her room, and the doll was sitting on the bed, not on the floor, not in the corner. It was on the bed next to Clara's pillow, with its face turned toward the door, toward me. But there's one detail I never told anyone. That day, I saw its eye move. I know dolls don't blink, especially those hard plastic ones with fixed eyes. But at that moment, it was quick, a light twitch, like the eyelid had gotten stuck for a second and then returned. I froze, stood in Clara's doorway with my breath caught, trying to find an explanation. Maybe the light, maybe sleepiness, maybe I imagined it. But it wasn't that, because when I went a step back, its head tilted slightly. Not much, just enough to make it clear that it knew I was there. And that's when Clara sat up in bed suddenly, without making noise, and said, "She doesn't want you to be angry with her." The next morning I tried to tell my mom, but she just gave that typical, "You're seeing things, boy," and went back to her routine. But Clara started having nightmares every night, and the worst part was it was always the same one. She would wake up crying, saying the room had gotten too big and she couldn't get out anymore. Like the doll was taking her somewhere, like there was a parallel space inside that room that only opened while we slept. And there's only one thing scarier than hearing your sister talk about that with real fear in her eyes. It's going into her room on one of those nights and finding the doll in the middle of the room with its arm extended toward you, like it had been waiting for you. It was on a Sunday morning. My mom had gone to the farmer's market, and I was home watching Clara. She was playing in her room with the doll, and I went to the kitchen to make a sandwich. Quick thing, not even 10 minutes. But when I came back to check on what she was doing, the room was empty. I mean really empty. The bed was made, the toys were put away, the doll was sitting in the corner, but no sign of Clara. I called out, searched the whole house, opened even the cleaning supply closet thinking she might have hidden there. Nothing. Then suddenly I heard her voice coming from the room, low, very low. When I went back there, Clara was lying on the floor in the middle of the rug with the doll in her arms and both eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling like they'd just seen something horrible up there. She wouldn't talk, just trembled. And when my mom got home and saw her, she ran with her to the hospital. The doctors said it could have been a mild seizure, but you know what made my blood freeze? The nurse pulled me aside and asked if Clara played with someone in the family named Lydia. And that name never existed in our family. But when we got back home, it was written in red chalk on her bedroom wall. After that day, my mom didn't want to hear any more talk. She sent the doll straight back to the cousin who had given it as a gift. Sent it through the mail without a note, without explanation. I saw her pack the doll with bubble wrap, thick tape, everything just right. And I saw when the box was taken by the mailman. I saw it, but 4 days later the box was at our door, sealed with our name written again, same sender. But when my mom called the cousin, the woman swore she never received anything. Said she was traveling, didn't even know what we were talking about. So my mom freaked out. She threw the doll in the trash, in one of those big dumpsters that stay on the corner. And that night, for the first time in weeks, I slept peacefully. Clara too. No whispering, no weird noises, no strange dreams. But then came the next morning, and the bizarre thing wasn't finding the doll back. The bizarre thing was finding it sitting at the kitchen table with an empty plate in front of it, and one of our dirty forks propped beside it, like someone or something had left it there after breakfast. After that, we never talked about the doll again. My mom went into automatic mode, like whoever just wants everything to pass quickly. She took Clara to spend a few days at our grandmother's house, and when they came back, she already had a different tone. Said we should forget it, that kids make things up, that I was too impressionable. But there's one detail: the doll didn't disappear. It's stored to this day, locked in a trunk at the back of my mom's bedroom closet. It was never seen outside of there again, but nobody had the courage to throw it away again either. Clara grew up and doesn't remember much, or says she doesn't. When I ask her, she just laughs kind of awkwardly and changes the subject. Sometimes when I'm alone, I catch myself trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that kids exaggerate, that we dream while awake and invent memories that never existed. Look, it's been so many years that I've tried to forget this that it's hard to know where to begin. But yesterday, listening to a thunderclap very similar to that day, it seems like everything came back. The smell of wet woods, the taste of dirt in my mouth, that feeling that something was walking behind me. But there's something else. Sometimes, late at night when the house is completely quiet, I swear I can hear something moving around upstairs. Soft footsteps, like a child walking around. And every time I hear it, I think about that trunk in my mom's closet. I think about whether that doll is still sitting there in the dark, waiting. Whether it remembers Clara's voice, whether it remembers mine. Whether it's still trying to be a companion to someone who's long since grown up. And the worst part, sometimes I wonder if getting rid of it was ever really possible at all. Because some things, once they've found their way into your family, into your home, into your life, they don't just leave because you want them to. They wait, they're patient. They know that eventually someone will open that trunk again. Someone will think it's just an old doll, just a harmless toy from childhood. But I know better. And someday, when my mom is gone and Clara has kids of her own, that trunk will need to be cleaned out. Someone will find that doll, probably think it's kind of vintage and charming. And maybe they'll give it to their own daughter, thinking they're just passing along a family heirloom. I hope I'm wrong. I hope time has made it just a doll again, just fabric and plastic and nothing more. But deep down, I know that's not how these things work. Some companions never really say goodbye. They just wait for the next person who needs their special kind of company. And that scares me more than anything else. Good evening. My name is Tessa, and though I try not to sound dramatic, I need to tell you that I was never friends with the early morning hours. When I lived with my parents and two sisters in our cramped duplex in Sacramento, I'd cross the city on two rattling buses that groaned at every turn. I'd arrive at school with my arms numb from sleep. Years later, I landed a steady job at the front desk of an auto parts distributor. I promised myself that as soon as I saved up some extra money from my Christmas bonus, I'd rent something close to work. Size didn't matter, as long as I woke up to the hum of a fan instead of bus brakes at 4 a.m. The studio apartment I found was a shoebox bed pushed against the wall, creaky wardrobe, two-burner stove, and a window that faced a narrow hallway where air barely moved. Still, every time I turned that key, I felt a foolish pride. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I'd repeat that like a mantra. At first, the routine felt fair. I'd clock in at 8, answer phones, check invoices, and during breaks I'd unwrap a turkey sandwich from my thermal lunch bag. But on quiet days, I noticed a strange silence. My phone rarely buzzed, just delivery ads or overdue bills. Coworkers talked about concerts and trips, and I'd smile, pretending my calendar was full, while only thinking about the journey home. Sometimes I'd rest my chin in my hands and whisper to myself, is this what living alone is? Freedom or isolation? I'd justify it as an adjustment period. It'll get better after the third rent payment. But I carried this feeling of standing on a step that led nowhere. My dad used to say independence costs dearly. My mom would call late, asking about the frozen beans and Tuesday's trash pickup. I'd say yes, even when the container was molding in the fridge. It seemed easier to play strong. I wasn't unhappy all the time. The smell of bread from the corner bakery, the magazine stand lady who saved my crossword puzzles, the doorman from the building next door who'd give me a small chocolate little things that held me together through the week. Still, on certain early mornings, I'd wake before the alarm. I'd stare at the ceiling, feeling a weight that wasn't pain, just presence like an extra pillow pressing against my chest. I'd whisper that it was anxiety, that everyone feels it. I'd turn on my side, breathe deep, count to 10. But the thought would circle. Am I going somewhere or just walking in circles? Then I'd get up, make coffee in my cloth strainer, hold the mug with both hands, and watch the sky brighten through the curtain cracks. The steam would rise slowly, and I'd remember my grandmother, who wakes early sees the day being born without rush. I don't know if it was a blessing or a warning. Lately, the sun rises too fast, and I fall behind. I wanted to believe it would all make sense later, but at that point, my biggest fear was staying exactly where I was spinning in circles without noticing. Marcus appeared when I'd stopped paying attention to who entered the hallway. He came to cover vacation time in the warehouse, and first thing in the morning, he asked where to stamp the exit forms. I answered almost automatically. He smiled like that was enough. The next day, he placed 2 cups of coffee with milk on my desk, said he'd ordered wrong and didn't want to throw them away. I laughed, blushing. Within days, it became routine. He'd stop by, tell me about his dog that wakes before the rooster, or the broken-down bus on the overpass, always ending with some silly phrase that made me forget about the clock. When I realized it, I was telling him how I made a sofa out of a rolled-up mattress. He pretended to be outraged, but listened to every detail. I started waiting for the sound of his footsteps. I agreed to go out after work to a food truck. We walked to the boardwalk, shared a burrito, and laughed at the stuffy wind that promises rain but never delivers. At the bus stop, holding closed umbrellas, he said, "I like talking with you, Tessa." I went back to my studio repeating that phrase, laughing alone. For a few weeks, I lived in that glow. Good morning texts, passion fruit juice, company halfway down the street. Nothing luxurious. Just being there was enough to break the silence that weighed on me. Then everything loosened. First, delayed responses, then disappearing during breaks. He wouldn't even pass by reception. When I tried to start conversations, his eyes would dart away like someone looking for an emergency exit. I'd repeat to myself that he was just swamped, but my stomach sensed otherwise. One night I asked if he'd wait for me. It was late. He gave me a look and nothing else. I went back hugging my purse in the hallway. I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, empty space. I slept poorly. Woke up drenched in sweat. No notifications on my phone. The pattern solidified. His distance, my self-blame. Coworkers said he was acting strange. Sometimes I'd cry in the shower. Sometimes I'd hold everything until my eyes burned on the bus. Shame silenced me. I feared hearing the obvious. I'd gotten attached too quickly. I kept storing everything with no space for anything else. One early morning, I sat with my phone and typed, "Why does someone just disappear?" I fell into tarot videos, spells, promises of bring him back in 7 days. I closed the tab, but returned minutes later. Among the links appeared Walter's website, Energy Therapist. Comments spoke of lightness, of closing toxic cycles. I copied the number, deleted it, saved it again. The cursor blinked. I typed, "Good evening, I need guidance," but I didn't send it. I stared at the words like someone staring at a cliff. I deleted them, breathed, counted the tiles on the neighboring building, and in an impulse pressed send. As soon as the message went through, my heart raced. I thought about deleting everything, blocking the contact, uninstalling the app, anything to avoid the response. But he appeared online in seconds, as if he were on the other side of the screen, waiting for someone to stumble over their own neediness. I felt relief and fear in equal measure, like opening a door and discovering a room with no light or visible floor. I scheduled the appointment for the following Wednesday. I left work still wearing my ID badge and let GPS guide me to a neighborhood of narrow streets full of corner stores closing their metal doors. The bus swayed so much I had to read messages twice. Walter always responded with perfect punctuation, as if he had all the time in the world. I got off in front of a duplex house, cream facade, freshly painted white slat gate. A guinea plant pushed leaves through the bars. I rang the bell. The latch made a dry click, and Walter appeared smiling, short sleeves and a simple wooden necklace. "Tessa, make yourself comfortable." Inside, the house seemed longer than it looked from outside. Dull ceramic floor, hallway lit by yellow bulbs. The smell mixed cheap incense and reheated coffee. He handed me a warm mug. "Mate with mint. Helps calm," he said, stirring the liquid with a small spoon. I drank out of politeness, trying to hide the tremor in my fingers. He pointed to a room next door. The space was almost empty. Thick rug, some cushions, a low table covered with a burgundy cloth. On top, a worn deck of cards and a brown egg resting on a small stand. I sat cross-legged. Walter turned off the main light. Only a corner lamp remained, casting soft shadows on the walls. "I don't need you to tell me anything. The field speaks first," he commented, shuffling the cards in such a calm rhythm that each paper flip seemed like a slow clock. He opened 3 cards, studied the images, and when he raised his eyes, he took my hand without asking permission. His fingers were cold and surprisingly firm. "Someone left your life, taking pieces of you. The pain became a crack. If you don't seal it soon, everything gets in." I swallowed hard. I thought about Marcus but pretended neutrality. Walter pressed his thumb into the center of my palm like someone testing bread dough. "You carry something different. It's not a defect, it's a point of light. You just need to clean the surroundings." I felt like laughing and crying at the same time. He placed my hand over the egg on the stand, then took a rue branch and began passing it from my shoulders to my ankles, chanting words I didn't understand softly, almost a whisper. The green aroma mixed with the incense. The air became heavy like a locked room in humid summer. In the first minutes, I tried to understand what I was feeling. Tingling at the nape of my neck, slight dizziness, a buzzing behind my ears. Then I abandoned counting. Each breath seemed to cost double. The rug's edges became blurred as if water were taking over my vision. Walter asked me to lie down. The rough fabric scratched my arms when I stretched out. He placed the branch on my chest, touched the egg to my forehead, and rang a small bronze bell. The sound vibrated inside my skull, amplified, deep. Though the object seemed tiny, I lost track of time. I have memories of trying to say something. Maybe everything's fine, but the words wouldn't come out. I blacked out. I woke to the distant sound of an engine outside. I was on a couch I didn't remember seeing. The lamp showed almost 11 at night. Walter sat on the floor, moving small stones over a mirror. "It was intense but necessary," he said without looking at me. "Not everyone can handle it the first time." I tried to get up. My legs felt filled with wet sand. He offered more mate, saying the body spends energy expelling impurities. I asked the time. He answered unhurriedly, as if nothing were rushing, still Wednesday. I grabbed my purse, thanked him, and left. The gate creaked low, and the cold street air hit my sweaty arms. At the bus stop, I checked my phone, 23 missed calls from my mom, none from Marcus. I breathed deeply, promising to call when my head cleared. On the ride, I pressed my forehead against the window. The vehicle's vibration echoed in the same tone as the bell. For a moment, I thought it was ringing again, but it was just the bus brakes. Still, my hands shook until I got home. I arrived home past midnight, but it felt like mid-afternoon on a stuffy day. The room seemed too bright. Though the lamp was off, I threw my purse on the floor and noticed the wardrobe corner was out of place, as if someone had pushed it a few inches. I frowned. I could have bumped into it in the morning, but I didn't remember. I turned on the fan, rubbed my eyes, and the scene returned to normal. Maybe I was the one who was crooked. When I lay down, the pillow smelled like rue, but I hadn't brought the branch home. I turned to the side, trying to ignore the damp green smell that stuck to my nostrils. I counted the mental steps of the work hallway, a technique I used to fall asleep. But I stopped at the 8th step. A wood crack came from the wardrobe. I waited for another sound to confirm if it was imagination. Nothing. I tossed and turned, laughing nervously at the silly scare, until I felt my body grow heavy. Numbness started in my feet, climbed through my knees, and settled in my chest. I opened my eyes, or thought I did, and the room was the same except the wardrobe door was now wide open. Inside, my hanging coats swayed slightly. I tried to move any finger, any muscle, but it was like being pure fresh cement. The hallway light filtered through the blinds drew a dark silhouette behind the clothes, something upright, head down, long hands running over the hangers. I couldn't see its face, just the slow movement of bony fingers examining piece by piece, like someone looking for something intimate. I wanted to turn my face, but my neck refused. I felt warm tingling behind my eyes, short breath almost swallowed. In a second, the figure disappeared. The doors slammed shut by themselves, and I woke gasping, completely soaked in sweat. It took me several minutes to build courage to get up and open the wardrobe. Everything was in order, but the burgundy coat was on the floor, button torn off. I put it back, muttered that it might have fallen earlier, and returned to bed with my heart pounding in my ears. The next morning, I dragged myself to work. The monitor emitted a bluish reflection that turned my stomach. I sorted protocols, but when I checked the stamp, I realized the main sheet was missing. I searched through drawers, nothing. I was sure I'd stamped it, but there was a 3-minute void in my memory, as if someone had stolen small pieces of my day. I made up a story to my boss that the printer had eaten the document and reprinted it. Meanwhile, a thin buzzing settled in the back of my head, reminiscent of the bell's last note. That night, sitting on the edge of the bed, I ran my hand over the peeling tile near the outlet. There was a delicate crack that hadn't existed before. It looked like a hair strand stuck to the wall. I traced the design with my nail. A flake came loose and fell like eggshell. I swallowed a curse word and took a photo to send to the building manager, but the screen went dark before I could hit send. The phone restarted, showing the wrong date 2 days ahead. I adjusted it, blamed the old battery, and swallowed the discomfort. In the early morning, I woke with a dry mouth and went to the kitchen. When I turned the faucet, I felt something brush my ankle. I stepped back, nothing but my pajama hem. I laughed softly. I filled the glass, and in the window's reflection, I saw the crack had duplicated, now running down the opposite wall. The sudden sound of dishes made me jump. Both coffee cups cracked inside the dish rack, fine lines crossing the porcelain. I remembered Walter talking about impurities breaking where energy hits first. I shuddered. I went back to bed, hugging the pillow, and accidentally opened the chat with him. The icon was green online. My finger hovered over the keyboard. I still feel strange. Is this normal? I typed but didn't send. I stared at the words until they seemed foreign. I deleted the message, blocked the contact, unblocked it again. The indecision hurt more than insomnia. I ended up sleeping with the screen on while the fan's vibration masked any external sounds. 2 days later, I arrived late to work. The reception clock showed 9, but I swore I'd left home at 7. The supervisor asked if I was okay. I said yes, it was the bus. When I reached into my back pocket, behind my bus pass, I found the ticket with a validation time of 8:40. I had no memories of the last hour and a half. It was a black hole. I went back to thinking about Walter, about his deep voice saying I was opening doors without realizing it. Because I was listening to him even when blocked. That night, sitting on the bathroom floor, the only cool place in the studio, I noticed the main crack branching to the base. I touched the tile, felt a slight vibration, almost a pulse. I heard myself saying out loud, "This is just building expansion, Tessa." Even explaining, I couldn't fool myself. I opened the messaging app and with trembling thumb typed to Walter, "I think I need that deeper cleansing." I sent it. The response came before I could decide if I regretted it. Saturday, 9 p.m. Bring a piece of clothing you really like. Trust the process. He ended with a serene emoji, as if it were a park stroll. I read and reread, heart beating to the fan's rhythm. I tried to cancel, but the notification already showed as read. I closed the phone, turned off the light, and curled up, swearing to myself that if anything sounded strange, I'd run from there. However, while repeating this promise, I noticed through the door the crack gaining another silent inch. Inside it, for an instant, There seemed to be a darkness that didn't belong to the wall, but to another place. Saturday arrived stuffy, clouds trapped in the sky without courage to rain. I spent the day cleaning the same tile, anxious. Walter had scheduled 9 p.m., asking me to bring a cherished piece. I chose a navy blue blouse, folded it in a plastic bag, and kept rehearsing excuses in case I wanted to back out. I left the building at 8:30. The bus came slowly. I counted cracks in the floor to avoid thinking. The house seemed the same, but the external lamp trembled in a yellowish tone that reminded me of fever. The guinea plant had wilted. I rang the bell. The latch unlocked soundlessly. I entered. Inside, the hallway smelled of sour incense. Walter appeared holding a candlestick with 4 candles. He didn't greet me, just extended his hand for the bag, held the blouse against the flame, smiled satisfied, and placed it on a narrow table in the center of the room, now without a rug. Around it, dry petals cracked when I stepped on them. "Lie down and release your body," he ordered. I climbed onto the table covered with a white sheet. The ceiling showed moisture stains that looked like maps. He picked up a bell larger than the previous one, darkened bronze. First strike, wide sound that seemed to press the air. I tried to move my head but couldn't move any muscle. Second strike, an electric shiver through my whole body. The burgundy cloth covering a mirror nearby vibrated. The room darkened at the corners. Walter murmured words I didn't recognize. I felt a cold scratch on my thigh, but no one was near. Gray dust spun above my chest, accompanied by the smell of forgotten meat. He placed the blouse over my face. The fabric, damp with my own sweat, stuck to my lips. I heard my name inside my throat, a deep voice saying, "Let go." An imaginary needle pierced the breastbone. I tried to scream. Nothing. When he removed the blouse, he also pulled away the mirror's cloth. My reflection didn't follow my movements. Behind me, attached like a shadow, was a thin silhouette with long arms wrapped around my shoulders. A dry smile opened, revealing worn teeth. 2 short horns protruded from its forehead. I inhaled short breaths, tasting rust. Walter brought the bell close to the mirror. The surface rippled. The shadow slipped out of the frame, falling to the floor curled in fetal position. The skin was black, stretched over bones, sparse hair matted. It looked dead, but the chest sank and rose in wet breaths. A thick, humid heat filled the room. At that moment, the rigidity that held me broke. I rolled off the table, hitting my shoulder. Walter stepped back, eyes wide. I stumbled over the dry petals, forced the front door. The bolt gave way after the second attempt. I ran barefoot to the gate, feeling the cold street air cut my skin. I only stopped 3 blocks later, breathless, when the bell still rang inside my head without existing in the world. The bus seemed to crawl. Each traffic light seemed to last an eternity. The driver drummed on the steering wheel, sweat running down his arm. The windows reflected my pale face. The trip that usually takes 20 minutes took almost 40. I felt that somehow this delay was part of the ritual, preparing something I didn't yet understand. When Walter had asked me to breathe deeply, the air burned my throat. He turned his neck like someone hearing whispered instructions. Inside my chest, my heart alternated rapid beats with long pauses to the point where I feared it would stop. The moment the shadow came out of the mirror brought absolute silence. Even the candles crackling ceased. The lifeless body inflated from inside out. The smell became coagulated blood in old pipes. I had the sensation of a black hole opening in the creature, ready to pull me in. Outside the house, I noticed stones scraping the soles of my feet, but didn't slow down. The gate creaked loudly, but Walter didn't appear. The humid air felt like temporary relief. In the rideshare car, I shook so much the driver asked if I needed help. I muttered, "Low blood sugar," and accepted water. Red lines scratched my arms, cuts made by the dry petals, sharp as tiny blades. In the cold shower, the water ran murky, carrying the dark dust from my hair. I scrubbed nails and neck. The smell resembled wet earth. When I closed the faucet, the metal vibrated in a low pitch that imitated the bell. I covered my ears and counted to 50, begging the sound not to become a voice. I sat on the wet floor, hugging my knees. I repeated almost breathlessly, "Never again, never again, never again. Mom, I need to come back for a few days." That's all that came out of my hoarse mouth on an early Sunday. She didn't ask for details, recognized the fear in my silence, and said she'd wait for me with hot lunch. I stuffed clothes in my backpack and fled the studio like someone leaving the stove on. At the old duplex gate, her hug was so strong my back cracked. Noticing the scratches, she frowned but held the question until we served the rice. I told everything at once: Marcus, Walter, the bell, the mirror, the shadow. She stirred the beans slowly, as if each turn of the spoon processed a piece of the horror, and concluded, "None of this gets resolved alone. I know Mrs. Zelia, she'll see us today." I had no strength to argue. I slept all afternoon on the old bunk bed, fan creaking, but woke twice feeling weight on my feet as if someone sat there. When the clock blinked 6 p.m., my mom was already waiting at the door. We took the circular bus, the stuffy air sticking to our skin. We got off on a cobblestone street. Children played ball, bread smell escaped from a bakery, almost closing. Mrs. Zelia's house was set back, low wall, porch taken over by ferns. She appeared at the door, colorful scarf holding her graying hair. "Come in, child." The living room exhaled lemon balm tea and old floor wax. I sat hugging my backpack while my mom settled in a corner, rosary in her pocket. Mrs. Zelia asked me to tell only what was impossible to silence. I summarized. She listened to the end and declared, "They opened your chest like someone puncturing an orange to suck it. This man doesn't create evil, child. He just finds hunger and offers the plate. He's a shepherd of bad things." First I stopped the bleeding, then I removed the creature. I chose the armchair. I wanted my eyes open. She lit a short candle, dripped rosemary oil on my wrists, and let me breathe it in. The freshness opened my chest. On the small table, a silver bell cracked at the edge. Before ringing, she warned, 3 chimes. If a voice comes after, pretend you don't understand. First chime clear, thin sound crossing the scalp and descending through my arms. Second, the air vibrated in my stomach. I felt each organ shift millimeters. Third, warm weight on my shoulders, and my eyes closed without command. In the darkness, my mother's image appeared, kneeling and crying like the night of the hug, but her face melted in gray plates. She buried nails in my hand. The pain was absolute. I wanted to scream but remembered. "Trick," I repeated mentally. "It's not real." The figure trembled like TV out of signal and became thick smoke. I felt a metallic taste in my mouth. Behind me, something scratched the floor. Failed laughter whispered my name. I filled my head with water accounts, shopping lists, bus schedules, banalities. The sound disappeared. I opened my eyes. Mrs. Zelia touched the bell to the extinguished candle. Sweat shone on her forehead, but she smiled. It tested, but you didn't give in. First battle won. My legs collapsed. She served me water with lemon and passed the damp cloth on my neck. When I reported the vision, she noted in an old notebook and warned, "The thing will use dreams and cherished memories. If you hear a bell out of hours, stay still and hold your anger. Strong anger is food for it." On the way out, we bought coarse salt and rue at a grocery store, lowering its doors. I held the bag like a medal. On the bus, warm wind hit my face. My mom squeezed my arm, a silent sign that the path would be long but not solitary. Sleeping in my childhood room with the hallway light on, the thing didn't appear, but I woke with fine marks on my ankles like ribbons that tighten almost to the point of cutting. I applied ointment, breathed deeply, and repeated, "It bites, but doesn't devour those who don't surrender." Monday, I returned to reception like someone stepping on eggs, each step calculated not to slip on anxiety. I took a small rue branch inside my purse. Mrs. Zelia said it helps confuse the thing's scent. I put the branch in a disposable cup next to the monitor, pretending it was aromatherapy nonsense. No one commented on the smell. Only the security guard raised an eyebrow, but soon looked away. I opened the system, checked protocols, and passed along automatic messages. The simpler the task, the more I forced myself to be careful. Complete breathing, lowered shoulders, thoughts anchored in the here and now. I wanted to prove to myself that I still belonged to the place where the badge flashes green. Near 9, the floor seemed like an empty church. The analysts had an off-site meeting. The warehouse awaited a parts truck. And the air conditioning blew a constant wind that reminded me of seasonal change flu. It was in all that silence that the sound began. First, just a subtle vacuum, as if someone removed the world's background noise. Then metallic vibration, brief, distant, maybe in the access hallway where the emergency light blinks. I closed the email mid-sentence. My palms sweated. Mrs. Zelia's voice hammered, "If you hear the bell, don't move a finger." I pushed the chair back but didn't get up. I left my hands in my lap, firm. I looked at the dark reflection on the blank screen. Beyond my silhouette, nothing. The sound repeated, now clearer, almost round, reverberating in the inner part of my skull. If I closed my eyes, I'd see the hallway stretching like a funnel. I kept them open. The rue branch trembled without wind. I smelled hot iron. For seconds, I don't know how many, my head split in half. Half begged for escape, half remembered the ankle ribbons and decided not to feed the creature. The bell advanced a tone vibration that seemed to displace the air. That's when I saw something from the corner of my eye, shadow, passing beyond the glass door, stretched without volume. I breathed so deeply my chest hurt. A deep voice identical to the mirror's whispered my name as if it were inside the air conditioning. The metal sound suddenly ceased, replaced by a dry crack in the light fixture. The lamp above my desk flickered. I stayed seated, hands motionless. I mentally counted breaths. 1, 2, 7. When the light stabilized, the phone rang. The jump I gave was internal. Externally, I just extended my arm and answered. Almost normal voice. Reception, good morning. I spoke, feeling my tongue pasty. It was the delivery guy asking for address confirmation. While I talked, my knees trembled, but the bell didn't return. I noted the protocol, thanked him, hung up, and noticed the rue branch had turned gray, dehydrated in minutes. I got up to get water. The hallway seemed short again, but with each step came the doubt. Was I the only one who heard it? The break room exhaled reheated coffee. I opened the faucet and drank directly, trying to clean the metallic taste. In the stainless steel door's reflection, I saw a purple spot at the junction of neck and shoulder. I touched it. It wasn't big, but it had an almost black-violet tone in the center, as if a finger had pressed the skin for hours. I went back to my desk and typed a short message to my mom. All calm, I'll call you later. I didn't want to worry her or scare myself by recalling details. I tore off a sticky note and wrote, "Read grocery list," and stuck it on the monitor's edge. A small reminder of normal life. The rest of the morning dragged, but without new signs. Still, I avoided looking at the big clock on the wall. The chrome pendulum reminded me too much of the bell's slow movement. At exactly 5 p.m., I turned off the computer, threw the wilted branch in the recycling bin, and left without talking to anyone. On the street, the honking horns seemed like music to me. I got on the crowded bus and mentally thanked the stranger's elbows pressing against me, proof of a solid world. With my forehead against the window, I thought about the shadow that had somehow crossed walls to find me. And despite the terror, a tiny point of triumph lit up. It expected the reaction. It didn't get it. When I arrived at the duplex, my mom was leafing through a recipe book, pretending she wasn't apprehensive. I hugged her shoulder, served 2 glasses of juice, and confessed, half laughing, half crying, "Today the thing rang, but I stayed still. I think it worked." She closed the book and squeezed my hand, eyes teary. "You're coming back to yourself, girl." I didn't answer. I felt for the first time in weeks that maybe it was true. The following days became a slow drip rhythm. Work, home, home, work, weekly sessions with Mrs. Zelia, fatigue that ached in my joints. Each meeting started the same. She'd ring the cracked bell. I'd relive a blurred memory. The thing would try to infiltrate guilt or shame, and we'd push it out. Sometimes it was subtle, the smell of spoiled coffee instead of incense, a shadow crossing the wall like smoke. Other times it came heavy, with light failures and sharp pain in my temples. Even so, something was changing. I slept 2 nights straight without paralysis. The cracked tile in the studio stopped growing. The mirror's reflection no longer brought extra company. There was still uncomfortable silence after sessions, as if the air awaited my first doubt to surround me again. But I began filling this vacuum with trivial tasks: washing dishes, reorganizing drawers, reading spice labels at the market. Each concrete gesture seemed to cement my place in the real world. 15 days later, I decided to face the computer screen as a weapon. I searched Walter's name on forums, networks, review sites. I discovered enthusiastic praise mixed with vague complaints. In one of these complaints, a woman mentioned a therapist with identical methods in another city, but with a different name. I created an anonymous profile and wrote everything: the promise of healing, the forced sleep, the figure coming out of the mirror. Nothing about entities or curses. I used words anyone would understand: manipulation, abuse of trust, psychological damage. I hesitated before posting. Part of me feared he'd sense the keyboard noise from a distance and come to collect. I posted anyway. I closed the browser with trembling hands, not from guilt, but from the sensation of freeing an angry bird. The following week, I received an email from a stranger. I went through this too. I didn't respond. It was too early to be someone's confidant when I was still trying to understand the size of my own damage. But the message confirmed that Walter collected open doors, soft hearts, disguised cracks to house his hungry creature. I understood that exposing was part of the collective exorcism. When I returned to the studio to get bills and winter clothes, I was surprised by the smell of common dust, no sign of smeared incense or wilted rue. I boxed memories quickly. The first cup of coffee Marcus brought, the pillow that smelled like rue without explanation, the tile that cracked like dry leather. Before leaving, I left the window ajar. The warm wind swayed the light curtained banal without hidden ghosts. In the last session, Mrs. Zelia didn't ring the bell. She placed a clay tray on the table, filled it with water, and asked me to face the surface. I saw my reflection tired but whole. She said that if the thing returned, the first crack would be psychological, not supernatural, the doubt that would allow new invasion. I noted mentally, watch the small sadnesses, water only what I want to grow. Today I write in the silence of my childhood room. The fan still creaks, but in an almost affectionate way. I painted the ankle marks with healing ointment lines already faint, memories of someone who once served as a house for what wasn't mine. Sometimes I wake thinking I hear metal vibrating far away. Maybe it's the sound's memory. Other times the bathroom mirror fogs with my reflection, even without steam. It's my scar. When this happens, I stay still, breathe 4 beats in, 4 out, and the world continues in place. I feel anger when I remember Walter, but I don't let it ferment. I transform it into care, an extended arm to people who insist on thinking that heartache requires magic. I want to scream to passersby, don't accept easy explanations. Loneliness isn't cured with mirror promises. What happened to me starts with neediness and ends in invisible wounds. If I've learned anything, it's this: not every door needs to be opened. I don't know if I'll ever return to the studio, maybe. But today, when I think about the crack, I no longer feel fear. I feel the callus that formed where the wound closed. I'll stay here where my mom beats beans with a wooden spoon and life smells like sautéed garlic. I haven't decided on tomorrow yet, but while I write, I realize the creature lost my address, and that's enough for today. We never had much, but life was peaceful. My dad, Arthur, was always a down-to-earth guy. He had a small body shop in the back of our property, a simple garage where he spent all day, sunrise to sunset, surrounded by the smell of paint and welding. My mom, Helen, took care of the house and us kids. I'm Vincent. At the time, I was 17. My sister, Sophie, was 10. We lived in a neighborhood house, one of those with a front yard and a bigger backyard where my mom grew a vegetable garden and a jabuticaba tree that barely produced fruit. The problem started in a stupid way. My mom had a terror of driving. My dad kept insisting, even bought her an old car, a beat-up compact model. It didn't help. She'd sit in the driver's seat and her hands would sweat, her chest would tighten. It was agony just to watch. Since the city was growing and things were getting farther away, my dad decided it was time to hire someone. A driver, a handyman, someone who could take my mom to the grocery store, pick up Sophie from school, those kinds of things. It was an acquaintance from the shop who recommended Sergio. He said the guy was trustworthy, had worked on ranches around there, decent people. I remember well the day he showed up at our house. He wore worn jeans and a well-pressed button-down shirt. He had a serious face that opened into an easy smile. He seemed honest. My dad talked with him for about 20 minutes right there at the gate and hired him. Sergio started the next day, and I have to admit, he was great, punctual, helpful, quiet. He didn't just drive, but did a bit of everything. He'd trim the grass, fix a dripping faucet, change a burnt-out bulb. My mom came to trust him with her eyes closed. My dad respected him because the work was done well. No messing around. Little by little, he gained space. He no longer asked permission to enter the kitchen and grab a glass of water. He kept the car keys on the family keychain with ours. It was like he was already part of the house. And it was there, in all that normalcy, that I started feeling something weird. Sometimes I'd catch him standing in the hallway, staring at nothing, like he was listening to something only he could hear. When he noticed my presence, he'd open that same smile and go take care of some task. It wasn't anything major, I know, but it was strange. A detail out of place. The image of him as the savior of the homeland got stronger, truly. A few weeks later, my dad came home for lunch with a closed face, a worried expression I knew well. The air compressor at the shop, his most important machine, had stopped working out of nowhere. It was an old machine, but it had never given problems like this. He'd already called a technician, but the guy could only come the next day. And a day stopped for my dad was a huge loss. Sergio, who was in the kitchen having coffee, heard the conversation. He waited for my dad to finish complaining, cleared his throat, and spoke softly, as if he didn't want to intrude. "Mr. Arthur, sorry to butt in, but at the ranch where I worked, the compressor was just like this one. Once it had the same problem. It was just a little piece of the pressure switch, a tiny thing that gets stuck." My dad looked at him somewhat skeptically, but desperation was stronger. "And you know how to fix this?" My dad asked, already getting up. "I think so, sir, if you let me take a look." The two went to the shop. I followed, curious. In less than half an hour, with a screwdriver and a piece of wire, Sergio had solved it. The machine went back to working with that familiar noise. You could see the relief on my dad's face. He patted Sergio on the back and said he'd saved the day. The second miracle came a month later, and it was with my mom. She started feeling a strange dizziness, a weakness that came and went without warning. She'd spend the day with headaches, a malaise that no pharmacy medicine could solve. She even went to the clinic, had blood tests, and nothing, everything normal. But she continued looking terrible, colorless. One afternoon, Sergio saw her sitting on the porch with her hand on her forehead. He approached carefully. "Mrs. Helen, you don't look well. Is it that dizziness again?" My mom nodded, confirming. He clicked his tongue, thoughtful. "You know, my grandmother back in the countryside used to make tea for this. A mixture of herbs, boldo, patanga leaf, and a few other things. Takes away the malaise instantly. If you'd like, I know where to find fresh leaves. I could get them tomorrow morning." My mom, not knowing what else to do, accepted immediately. The next day, he appeared with a bunch of leaves tied with string. The smell was strong, kind of bitter. My mom boiled water, prepared the tea, and drank it. I don't know if it was suggestion or if the tea was really good, but by the end of the afternoon, she was different. Color had returned to her face. That night during dinner, my parents talked about nothing else. What luck they'd had finding someone like Sergio, an angel who appeared to help. I just watched him quietly. To me, their luck seemed too well calculated. Too many coincidences, too easy solutions, but I had no way to prove anything. So I kept my suspicion to myself. But that was just the beginning. It was no use talking to my parents about it. Anything I tried to say sounded like nitpicking, like rebellious teenager stuff. So I shut up, but my eyes stayed open. I started observing Sergio. Not in an obvious way, of course. I just paid more attention to his gestures, the words he chose, the way he looked at things inside our house. And things started disappearing, small things without monetary value, but with value to us. One day my sister Sophie came home from school crying because she'd lost the hair clip our grandmother had given her. A blue butterfly with shiny stones. She swore she'd put it in her backpack. My mom said kids were like that, they lost everything, but I knew Sophie was attached to that clip. 2 weeks later, it was one of my mom's blouses, a simple cotton blouse she wore to sleep. She looked all over the house, went through the wardrobe, the dirty clothes hamper, nothing. She shrugged and said it must have gotten lost in the wash. But I'd seen that blouse drying on the backyard line the day before. What made me certain was on a Tuesday early morning. I woke up thirsty, throat dry. The house was in complete silence. I went to the kitchen in the dark without turning on the light so I wouldn't wake anyone. When I was heading back to my room, I looked through the living room window that faced the backyard, and I saw him. Sergio was there, standing near the clothesline. It was almost 3 in the morning. He wasn't collecting clothes, wasn't doing anything that made sense. He was simply standing there, holding my pajama shirt, one I'd worn the day before that my mom had washed. He held it close to his face, as if he were smelling the fabric. After a long minute, he hung it back on the line with strange care and turned, walking slowly toward the small addition in the back, where my dad had set up a little room for him to stay when needed. I felt something strange. It wasn't exactly fear, it was the certainty that something was very wrong. That wasn't normal. At breakfast, I couldn't stand it. I waited for Sergio to leave with the car to take Sophie and spilled everything. Mom, Dad, I saw Sergio in the backyard last night at dawn. He was messing with my clothes on the line. My mom dropped her cup on the table with a loud noise. Vincent, for God's sake, this story again. The boy probably saw the weather was changing and went to secure the clothes better. You know how careful he is. At 3 in the morning, I insisted, my voice rising. He was smelling my shirt. My dad cut me off, his look hard, impatient. Enough, Vincent. We're tired of your nitpicking. The man only helps us. Never asked for an extra cent. And you keep creating ghosts. Have a bit of gratitude. I got up from the table. Anger rose through my throat. They simply couldn't see. They were completely blind. At that moment, I understood I was alone in this. And if I didn't do something, no one else would. The first person who came to mind was my Aunt Iris, my mom's sister. She'd always been different, the only one in the family who believed there were things we couldn't explain. The next day, I told my parents I was going to do schoolwork at a classmate's house. I got my bike and pedaled in the opposite direction to my Aunt Iris's house. She lived in an older neighborhood, in a little house with a low gate and ferns hanging on the porch. She received me with a glass of juice. She noticed I was nervous. I didn't need much to break down. I told everything, from Sergio's easy solutions to the dawn scene at the clothesline. I talked about Sophie's clip, my mom's blouse, my parents' blindness. I expected her to think I was crazy, but she listened without saying anything, just with a serious face, nodding slowly. When I finished, she spent some time looking at me. "I never liked that man's energy, Vincent," she said finally. "There's something in his look that doesn't give me confidence. Your parents are enchanted, that's it. And when we're enchanted, we can't see an inch in front of our noses." I felt such relief that my shoulders even relaxed. For the first time, someone believed me. "And what do we do, Aunt?" I asked. She thought for a bit, biting the corner of her lip. "There's a lady, her name is Elvira. She doesn't do miracles. She's not one of those who promise the world. She sees, understands these things about bad energy, evil eye, work done. We could go there just to talk. What do you think?" I'd agree to anything. That same afternoon, my aunt closed the house and we went. Mrs. Elvira's house was in a more remote place, at the end of a dirt road. It was a small house, painted a faded blue, with a smell of burning herbs coming from inside. Mrs. Elvira was a black lady with graying hair pulled back in a bun, and a look that seemed to go right through you. She told us to come in and sit in 2 simple chairs in a small room where the only decoration was an image of St. George, and a glass with water and a plant inside. She didn't ask anything, sat in front of us, and stared at me for what seemed like forever. "The boy came because the nest is infested," she said, her voice hoarse and calm. "A tame snake entered that feeds on trust. It's clouding your father's and mother's sight." My aunt and I looked at each other, startled by the precision. "It was something done, planted with intention," continued Mrs. Elvira without blinking. "They used pieces of clothing, hair things with your family's smell and energy to tie up their judgment. This man who's in your house, he's the hand that executes, but the head that thinks, the root that feeds this evil, is another. It's a woman one some know by the name of Maiden." I felt a chill in my stomach. A woman. "He meets with her outside your house. That's where he takes what he steals from you and receives orders," said the old lady. "If you want proof to open your parents' eyes, you need to discover where this exchange happens. Pay attention to his steps outside your gate. That's where the truth shows itself." From that day on, my life became a silent chase. Every time Sergio took the car to go out alone, I'd make up an excuse and follow on my bike. The first few times were frustrating. He'd go to the butcher shop, pharmacy, construction supply depot. He'd come back with receipts, everything proper. I started thinking Mrs. Elvira had been wrong, that I was going crazy. I told my aunt this over the phone and she was firm. "Calm down, Vincent. People like that are smart. They don't take false steps for nothing. Eventually, he'll slip up." And he did slip up. It was on a Thursday. He said he was taking the car to get the alignment and balancing done at a shop on the other side of town. My dad thought it was great, said it really needed it. I felt it right away. I called Aunt Iris. "It's today, Aunt. I can feel it. I'm coming to you. Wait for me at the corner of your street." She answered without hesitation. She arrived in her car, an old but well-maintained model. I got in quickly. The instruction was clear. Always keep about 2 cars distance. We followed my dad's car, driven by Sergio, through the downtown streets. He really went toward the shop he'd mentioned, but about 200 meters from the place, He turned onto a narrow street, one nobody uses, that led to the back of an old, abandoned coffee warehouse. My heart raced. "He's not going to any shop," my aunt whispered, maneuvering the car to a more distant spot where we could see the alley's exit. Sergio parked the car near a graffitied wall. A woman appeared, coming out from behind a pile of debris. She wasn't old or scary looking. On the contrary, she was an ordinary woman, maybe in her early 40s, with hair dyed black blue and an expressionless face. She wore a faded floral dress. The fact that she looked so normal was what was most frightening. He got out of the car. They didn't talk much. He took something from the passenger seat and handed it to her. It was a small, rectangular object. Even from far away, I froze. I recognized the hot pink cover full of little star stickers that Sophie had put on. It was her penmanship notebook, the notebook she'd lost the week before. "Take a picture, Vincent, now," my aunt ordered, her voice tense. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the phone properly. I opened the camera, zoomed in as much as I could. The image was grainy, horrible, but clear enough. I managed to take 3 photos. The moment of the handover, the woman putting the notebook in a plastic bag, the 2 of them talking with Sergio pointing toward our house. The phone's camera sound in the silence seemed too loud. They separated. The woman disappeared down an alley, and Sergio returned to the car, leaving the street and taking the road back home. We waited about 5 minutes in absolute silence, just hearing our own breathing. I looked at the phone screen, at those blurry photos. It was no longer a suspicion, it was proof. Disgusting, terrifying proof of what was happening right under our roof. Mrs. Elvira had told us that if we had proof, she'd know where to find the snake's nest. And now we had it. We didn't think twice. From that filthy alley, my aunt drove straight to Mrs. Elvira's house. The afternoon sun was already low, making everything an orange color. I showed the phone to the lady with trembling fingers over the photos. She looked at the screen for a long time, her face expressionless. There was no surprise there, just a somber confirmation. "I know where it is," she said finally. "It's not far from here. You'll take the dirt road that goes behind the old cemetery. Follow it for about 2 miles. You'll see a stream of dark water, almost still. On the other side of the wooden bridge, there's a small house made of blocks without plaster, with a barbed wire gate. The grass is tall, almost covering the entrance. That's the place." She handed us a cloth bag with something inside. "Coarse salt and a garlic clove. Keep it in your pocket. Don't touch anything with your hands. Don't eat or drink anything nearby. Go in, see what you need to see, and leave. Evil from a place like that sticks to your skin." We thanked her and left. The path was exactly as she described. The little dirt road was full of holes. My aunt's car bounced so much I had to hold on. The smell of wet grass and mold came through the windows. We found the bridge, the fetid stream, and soon after, the house. It was a forgotten place with heavy, oppressive energy. It felt like the air was denser there. The gate was tied with a piece of rusty wire. My aunt undid the knot carefully, and we entered. The front door was locked, but the back one, in the kitchen, was just ajar. One push was enough. The smell inside was suffocating, a mixture of humidity, old dust, and rancid candle wax. The kitchen was filthy, with dirty dishes and food scraps in the sink. The living room had just a torn sofa and a small table. It was in the house's only bedroom that we found what we were looking for. It wasn't a sleeping room, it was a kind of sick altar. On a table in the corner, covered with a stained black cloth, was the altar, and in its center, the focus of everything my family. There was a photo of my parents from their wedding day, but my mom's face was scratched out with something red. Next to it, Sophie's butterfly clip was stuck in a black candle, half melted. I saw a piece of my mom's blouse and my own pajama shirt folded in a strange way. But the worst was what was in the middle. A school ID photo of Sophie was glued to the head of a faceless rag doll. Around the doll's neck, a long strand of hair that could only be hers was tied tightly. And open in front of everything, the penmanship notebook. On a page where Sophie had written her name several times, someone had drawn over it a strange symbol, a kind of spiral with an eye in the middle. I felt a wave of nausea, an urge to break everything, to set fire to that filthy house, rising through my throat. I took a step forward, but my aunt grabbed my arm firmly. "No," she said, her voice barely a thread. "Don't touch. Take pictures, Vincent. Take pictures of everything." With sweaty hands, I took the phone from my pocket. I photographed every disgusting detail of that table. My mom's scratched face, the doll with Sophie's photo, the notebook. Each photo was a stab. We got out of there almost running. We got in the car, and my aunt sped down the dirt road, raising a cloud of dust. Only when we reached the asphalt did she stop on the shoulder. Neither of us could speak. We just sat there looking at the road with those images in our heads. Now there was no way to doubt. We had the poison and the proof. We arrived home, and my parents were in the living room watching TV. The sound of the soap opera filled the environment with a normalcy that seemed wrong. My aunt asked them to turn off the TV. The seriousness in her voice was enough for my dad to obey without questioning. We all sat on the sofa. The silence was heavy. "Helen Arthur," my aunt began, her voice calm but firm. "What Vincent has been saying isn't nitpicking. We discovered something very serious." I passed the phone to my mom's hand. The first photo that appeared was of the altar, the general view. She frowned, not understanding. "What is this witchcraft?" My dad grumbled with disdain. I moved to the next photo, a close-up of Sophie's clip stuck in the candle. My mom brought her hand to her mouth. Then the photo of my parents with her face scratched out. My dad's chin trembled. Finally, the image that sealed everything. The rag doll with Sophie's ID photo in place of the face. My mom let out a low sob, a torn sound of pure pain. She dropped the phone on the sofa as if it were burning. That's when the spell broke. Her face dissolved into silent tears. My dad picked up the device. He looked at each photo one by one. His face became hard, expressionless. I saw the practical man, who only believed in what he could touch and fix, being forced to face something that no tool in the world could repair. He didn't say anything, just got up and stood in the middle of the room, waiting. Half an hour later, we heard the car stopping in front. Sergio entered through the kitchen door, whistling softly as he always did. "Mr. Arthur, everything okay with the alignment?" He stopped talking when he saw our faces. My dad walked up to him and turned the phone screen in his direction. "Explain this," my dad ordered, his voice low and dangerous. Sergio looked at the photos. The friendly smile, the helpful expression, everything disappeared. His face became smooth, empty. There was no surprise or fear. There was just nothing. A vacuum. He looked at each of us, and his gaze stopped on me for a second longer. One corner of his mouth lifted in a hint of a smile, something that was pure mockery. "You're all fools," he said, his voice completely different, emotionless. Having said that, he turned and left our house. We never saw him again. No screaming, no confession, no fight. He simply disappeared, leaving horrible silence behind. That same night, my aunt brought Mrs. Elvira. The lady walked through every room of the house with a censer, releasing thick, fragrant smoke from herbs that stung our eyes. She prayed in a low voice, words I didn't understand. She threw a liquid with coarse salt in the corners of the walls. The environment seemed to get lighter, but the stain remained in our memory. 2 days later, my dad gathered the family around the kitchen table. "I can't anymore," he said, his look tired. "I can't sleep under this roof anymore. We're leaving. We'll sell everything. What we can't sell, we'll leave behind. We'll start over somewhere else, far from here, where nobody knows us." The decision brought strange relief, a false sense of freedom. We started boxing up our life, getting rid of things. With each closed box, it seemed like we were sealing a piece of that nightmare, in the naive hope that evil belonged to those walls, and we could simply leave it behind. We moved to a city about 4 hours away, a place where our last name meant nothing. The house was smaller, rented, but it seemed like a palace. My dad set up a makeshift shop in the garage, doing small repairs. My mom started crocheting to sell at a craft fair. For the first time in a long time, I saw her truly smile. Sophie adapted quickly to the new school. For about 3 months, we lived a peace we knew could end at any moment. We didn't talk about what had happened. It was a silent agreement. Sergio's name was never mentioned. The nights became silent again and sleep more peaceful. We started to truly believe we'd succeeded, that we'd left the nightmare behind, locked in that house that was sold for a pittance. We were naive. We thought evil had an address. The peace ended on a Saturday morning. My mom was changing Sophie's bed sheets. I was in the living room trying to fix headphones when I heard a strange sound. It wasn't a scream. It was a muffled thud followed by low, stifled crying. I ran to the room. My mom was on the floor, sitting beside my sister's bed. She was shaking from head to toe, her face white, colorless. In her open hand was a tiny object wrapped in red sewing thread. My dad arrived right behind me. He knelt beside her. "Helen, what happened? What is this?" With trembling finger, she opened her hand. It was a baby tooth, small, yellowed at the root. I recognized it immediately. It was the first tooth Sophie had lost when she was 6. My mom had kept it in a velvet box, a silly keepsake. The box had disappeared during the move. We thought we'd lost it among so many boxes, but it wasn't lost. It was there, loose under my sister's pillow in our new house, in our new life. At that moment, all the relief, all the hope we'd built collapsed. The air became heavy again. We understood it was never about the house. It was never about money. It wasn't even about Sergio. He was just the pawn. The target had always been her, my sister. We weren't running from a haunting. We were being watched, hunted. Today we live one day at a time. There's nowhere left to run. My aunt calls every week and sometimes talks to Mrs. Elvira, who sends us instructions over the phone. Light a candle, say a prayer, put a glass with water and salt behind the door. They're small rituals that give us the feeling we're fighting, but deep down, we know the truth. We weren't just robbed or haunted, we were marked. And the woman with the empty face, the maiden, is somewhere out there, waiting. We don't know what she wants with Sophie. And what scares us most is this living each day knowing the story isn't over. Good evening, Dom. I'd like to tell you about the story that changed my life, or rather, the story that destroyed part of it. My name is Sarah, and I was 20 years old when everything began to unravel. My husband Jake was 22, and we were living in a cramped studio apartment in rural Montana, barely making ends meet on his wages from the local meat processing plant. When I discovered I was pregnant, our already tight situation became impossible. Jake worked brutal shifts that left him exhausted, and his paycheck barely covered our rent and groceries. One evening, as he sat at our tiny kitchen table with his face drawn from fatigue, he suggested something that would change everything. "What if we moved in with my parents for a while?" he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Just until the baby comes and we can save some money." My mother had always warned me that living as a guest in your husband's family home was the beginning of the end of a woman's peace. But I was in love, pregnant, and honestly, completely worn out. I agreed. Jake's parents owned a small ranch about 30 miles outside of Billings. It wasn't a large property, but it was well maintained. A simple white house with a wraparound porch, and a yard of red dirt dotted with an old apple tree that provided good shade in the afternoons. My mother-in-law, Martha, welcomed me with a tight hug and a smile that immediately put me at ease. She assured me I'd be treated like a daughter and would want for nothing. Jake's father, Earl, was the complete opposite, a stern man of few words with a heavy gaze. He stood in the doorway watching me unload my few boxes, only nodding once. It wasn't a look of contempt, but something different, a look that seemed to be evaluating me. On one of our first nights there, he knocked softly on our bedroom door. When I opened it, he handed me an object, a baby mobile made by hand. It had a wooden base with dried, twisted branches hanging from nylon threads, small seeds attached to the tips. It was rustic work, somewhat crude. "For when he arrives," was all he said in that gravelly voice. I thanked him awkwardly, trying to find the gesture endearing, but I couldn't. There was something strange about those branches, the way they contorted. I stored the mobile on top of the wardrobe and tried not to think about it anymore. We settled in. Jake left before dawn and returned only at night. Martha took care of me as if I were made of porcelain, and Earl continued in his own world, leaving early for the small vegetable garden he maintained at the back of the property, and returning at dusk, almost always in silence. I told myself it was just his way, an older man from rural country, reserved. But occasionally I'd catch him looking at me sideways, a quick glance, almost reflexive. And it wasn't a look of anger, it was a look of curiosity. A curiosity that made me uncomfortable. Over the first few weeks, a routine began to form, but the peace I'd felt initially started to fade little by little. It was something subtle that began small. I'd be in the kitchen washing lunch dishes and see Earl pass through the hallway. He'd stop, look inside, and let out a heavy sigh, as if disappointed by something only he could see. Then came the comments. He never spoke directly to me. It was always to the air, to the walls, but the target was clear. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with my feet up because my ankles were swelling. He passed by, went to the gate, and said loudly to no one, In my day, pregnancy wasn't a disease. Women worked in the fields until the day before giving birth. My face burned instantly. I pretended not to hear, but the phrase kept hammering in my head. From then on, everything I did seemed wrong. If I cleaned the house, he'd find a dusty corner. If I helped Martha cook, he'd complain the food was undersalted. It was a slow, daily torture. At night in our room, I'd try to talk to Jake. "Your father doesn't like me," I'd confess in a low voice so no one would hear. "He thinks I'm lazy." Jake, always exhausted from work, would run his hand through my hair and try to calm me. "Don't think about it, honey. Dad's stubborn. He's always been like that. He doesn't speak out of malice, it's just his way." But it wasn't just his way. It was something personal I felt. Martha, poor thing, noticed the heavy atmosphere and bent over backward to make me feel welcome. She'd bring fruit, make an afternoon cake, and tell me to rest. "Don't mind Earl, my dear," she'd say, trying to mend her husband's rudeness. "His head is hard, but his heart is good." But her kindness only made his behavior seem worse. The house that had once seemed like a safe harbor began to feel small, suffocating. I felt constantly watched, spending more time in the bedroom, inventing excuses not to cross paths with him. The worst part was the silence when he was home, a heavy silence that took over everything, a dense air that seemed harder to breathe. One afternoon I was alone in the kitchen drinking a glass of water when I had that strange sensation that someone was behind me. My whole body got goosebumps. I turned slowly, my heart already beating differently. Earl was standing in the doorway that led to the yard, completely motionless, just looking at me with that same expression that said nothing. I don't know how long he stood there, it seemed like hours. Then, without saying a single word, he turned his back and left as if nothing had happened. In that moment, I was certain the problem wasn't just his difficult temperament. There was something more there, something that was just beginning. That episode in the kitchen was a turning point. The silent pressure I felt began to gain sound, and that's when the real fear began. It started during the early morning hours. I'd get up to go to the bathroom, a normal thing for pregnant women, and on my way back, passing through the living room, I'd hear it. It came from the couch where my father-in-law sometimes fell asleep watching television. It was a murmur, a low song without melody, with a broken and repetitive rhythm. I couldn't understand a single word. It was more a sound that came from the back of the throat, almost like a prayer in a language that doesn't exist. The first time, my body froze. I stood there in the dark hallway trying to understand what it was. I didn't have the courage to peek, just returned to the room on tiptoe, got under the covers, and prayed for sleep to take me soon. But the sound repeated on other nights. The strangest thing happened on a sunny afternoon. Martha and I were in the kitchen when we heard the familiar sound of Earl's bicycle arriving, the tire on the dirt, the creak of metal. Suddenly, a dull thud and silence. We ran out to the yard. He was there, fallen to his knees beside the bicycle with his hands flat on the ground. A bag of oranges had torn, and the fruit was scattered everywhere. His face had a pale, greenish color, and without warning, he began to vomit. It wasn't normal nausea. It was something violent, as if his body was trying to expel something by force. Martha ran to help him, supporting her husband who could barely stay upright. I stood paralyzed in the doorway, collecting oranges from the ground, but something else caught my attention. Rusty, the family's mutt who was usually glued to Earl, was huddled under a wooden bench near the laundry area. The dog was shaking so hard you could see it. When my father-in-law, supported by his wife, passed near the door to enter, Rusty let out a low whine, a cry of pure terror, and buried himself even deeper into the dark gap. From that day on, the animal never came near him again. Worse, Earl only had to enter a room for the dog to start whimpering softly wherever he was hiding. My father-in-law recovered from the illness, but remained different, quieter during the day and with the murmurs at night. The confirmation that all this wasn't in my head came a few days later. We had already set up the baby's crib in a corner of our room, a simple wooden crib we'd received from Jake's cousin. One night I came out of the shower, and upon entering the room, I felt the air leave my lungs. That mobile of twisted branches that Earl had given me, was hanging from the crib's support, spinning slowly in the breeze that entered through the window. My whole body went rigid. I had one certainty that turned my stomach. I had stored that thing on top of the wardrobe, pushed way back. "Jake, did you put this here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked without understanding. No, it must have been Mom. But I knew it hadn't been her. Martha would never enter our room and touch our things without warning. Someone had entered there, into our most intimate space, while we weren't there, and hung that strange object over the place where our son would sleep. It was no longer about complaints. It was no longer bad mood. That was an invasion, and I knew exactly who it had been. After what happened with the mobile, Jake no longer used the excuse that it was his father's way. He didn't admit in so many words that he was scared, but I could see in his eyes the same nervousness I was feeling. The house was in a state where we were all walking on eggshells, as if all of us, without coordinating, were holding our breath, just waiting for the next strange thing to happen. And it didn't take long. It was on a Sunday. Martha, in an attempt to bring some normalcy back, spent the entire morning in the kitchen. She prepared an elaborate chicken stew with okra, according to her, Earl's favorite. The good smell of the food spread through the house, almost making me believe things could be like before. We sat at the table for lunch, all four of us. The silence was tense. Earl served himself, took a piece of chicken, and brought it to his mouth. He chewed once, twice, and then stopped. His expression changed from neutral to one of disgust. With a brusque movement, he pushed the plate forward, making the food spill across the clean tablecloth. "What garbage is this?" he growled, his voice seeming deeper and more hoarse. "It tastes like something rotten." The three of us sat paralyzed. Martha looked at him with tears in her eyes, completely without reaction. Jake opened his mouth to speak, but Earl got up, knocked the chair against the table, and left toward the yard without looking back. But what really made us understand we had lost him happened a few days later. It was an ordinary afternoon, somewhat gray. Jake was at work. Martha was taking a nap. I was in the living room, sitting in an armchair near the window, folding some baby clothes I had washed. From there, I could see the porch. Earl was sitting in a wicker chair with his back to the field, looking at his own hands. At first, I thought he was just removing dirt from his nails, a normal gesture for someone who worked with the land. I looked away, but something made me look again with more attention. He wasn't cleaning his nails. With a strange calm that made me nauseous, he was using the nail of his right thumb to force the base of the nail on his left index finger. He kept digging at the cuticle and pushing, forcing the skin to come loose slowly. The scene was surreal. The skin began to open, a trickle of blood began to sprout at the base of the nail, but his face showed absolutely nothing, no grimace, no moan of pain. His expression was one of deep concentration, like a watchmaker fixing a tiny piece. He seemed to be enjoying it. My whole body froze. I couldn't scream, couldn't move, just watched. He forced a little more and then pulled. The nail came loose with a wet snap that I'm sure only I could hear. He sat looking at that little piece of nail on his fingertip for a few seconds. Then, with the most natural thing in the world, he dropped the piece of nail on the cement floor and wiped the blood running from his finger on his canvas pants. And he continued sitting there, looking at the weather as if he had just removed a speck from his eye. When Martha woke up and found me pale in the living room, I told her what I saw with a trembling voice. It was the first time I saw her break down. She sat beside me and cried, a silent, desperate cry. "That's not my husband anymore, Sarah," she whispered, squeezing her own hands. At night, sometimes I wake up and he's sitting on the bed, just looking at me with his eyes open without blinking. It seems like there's someone else in there, using his eyes to watch me. That night when Jake arrived, it wasn't necessary to say much. He found his mother with her face swollen from crying and me huddled on the couch, unable to stop shaking. The phase of making excuses had come to an end. Earl's mask had fallen, and what we were seeing underneath was something none of us there knew how to face. From that confession by Martha, the house became a territory of shared fear. We began to speak in whispers, exchanging frightened looks through the hallways as if the walls themselves could hear and tell him. Jake started coming home earlier from work, inventing excuses at the plant. No one wanted to be alone with Earl. And it was in this climate that the nights transformed into a new kind of hell. The murmur disappeared. In its place came crying, but it wasn't the cry of someone who is sad or sorry. It was a sound that seemed to come from the bowels of the earth, a deep lament that tore at his throat, the cry of a wounded animal, of a soul broken into 1,000 pieces. The sound crossed the walls and entered our room, making me curl up under the covers with my hands over my belly, as if I could protect my son from that agony. Jake would get up, go to his parents' bedroom door. "Mom, is everything okay in there?" he'd ask with a choked voice. "I don't know, my son." He won't stop. Her voice came weak, exhausted. Until one Wednesday, we woke up and he wasn't home. The bicycle was still leaning against the porch wall, the straw hat on its usual nail, the boots beside the door. He had simply disappeared in the middle of the night. The panic was immediate. Jake didn't go to work. We searched the field, the small patches of woods that surrounded the ranch, shouted his name until our throats hurt. Martha walked back and forth on the porch, praying softly, wringing her hands. A whole day passed. Night came, and with it an even greater fear, the fear of what he might do or what might be done to him. The next morning, very early, a neighbor who raised cattle a few miles away knocked on our gate. His face was one of pure astonishment. "I think I found your Earl," he said breathlessly. The man had found him collapsed inside the cattle pen, in the middle of mud, manure, and filth. When Jake and the neighbor brought him home, one on each side supporting him, I almost didn't recognize him. His clothes were torn, his body covered with a crust of dried mud, his hair matted with dirt. But the worst was his gaze. It was dead. An empty, opaque gaze that didn't focus on anything. He didn't look at us, he looked through us. We cleaned him like you clean a child. We sat him in a chair in the kitchen. Martha tried to give him some water, but the liquid dripped from the corner of his mouth. He was a heavy rag doll, lifeless. He just opened and closed his mouth slowly without any sound coming out. Until suddenly he stretched his neck back, opened his mouth in a way that didn't seem natural, and let out a scream. It was a sharp, strident yell so loud it made the glasses in the dish drainer vibrate. It wasn't a scream of pain or anger. It was just a sound that didn't seem human, that had no end. He screamed and screamed with his eyes glazed on the ceiling. Jake held him by the shoulders, shaking him, trying to bring him back. "Dad, Dad, look at me." But he didn't recognize anyone. He was lost. In that moment, trapped inside the house with those screams that wouldn't stop, I understood that the nightmare was no longer something we just watched. We were living inside it, and there was no exit door. The screams stopped after a few hours, but the silence that remained was almost worse. Earl entered a strange, catatonic state. He spent his days sitting in a chair in the living room, his gaze fixed on an empty point on the wall. His eyes sometimes moved quickly, as if following the flight of an insect only he could see. He didn't speak, didn't eat properly, didn't do anything, just existed there like an empty shell. Martha was at her limit, shoulders always drooping, face marked by deep dark circles. She seemed to have aged 10 years in 1 week. Even exhausted, she refused to leave his side. She dragged an old armchair to the corner of their room and began sleeping sitting up with a small lamp always on. She was afraid of being in the dark with her own husband. The end of any hope that this was a common illness came on a Thursday morning. A scream tore through the house's quiet, but this time it wasn't Earl's voice. It was a yell of pure terror, desperate. It was my mother-in-law's voice. Jake and I jumped from bed, ran to the living room, and found her stumbling out of her bedroom, white as paper, shaking from head to toe, and holding a rosary so tightly the knuckles of her fingers were white. "That's not my husband," she screamed, falling to her knees in the middle of the living room. "For the love of God, Jake, what's in that room is not your father." We lifted her up and sat her on the couch. Between sobs that shook her entire body, she told us what she had seen. She said she woke up suddenly with a horrible feeling of being watched. When she opened her eyes, she saw her husband lying in bed on his side, his back to her, but his head was turned back at an impossible angle, looking directly at her over his own shoulder. A human neck wouldn't do that without breaking, and he was smiling. According to her, it was a wide smile that pulled his lips in a grotesque way, a gash of mockery on the face she had once loved. It wasn't Earl, it was something else imitating her husband in a profane way. While Martha spoke, describing that horrible scene, I felt a sharp pang in my belly. My son began to move violently, almost painfully, as if he too felt the terror that had taken over the house. The air in the room became heavy, cold, and a strange smell spread, a smell of mold, of old things stored in closed places. Jake, pale, went to his parents' bedroom door, looked inside for an instant, and stepped back, closing the door slowly. He didn't say what he saw. He returned to the living room and just hugged his mother, who was shaking uncontrollably. We spent the rest of the night there, the three of us huddled on the couch with all the lights in the house on, waiting for the sun to rise. When the first rays of light entered through the window, there was nothing more to discuss. We weren't dealing with a nervous breakdown or dementia. Jake sat in front of me, his face that of a man much older than his 22 years, and made the decision. "I'm taking him to Miss Felicia," he said with a firmness I didn't know he had. Miss Felicia was an elderly healer who lived in a neighboring town, one of those ladies people sought when medicine and traditional faith no longer provided answers. She was our only and last option. That morning, getting Earl out of the house was a somber task. He offered no resistance, but his body was dead weight, limp as if his bones had softened. Jake and a neighbor who offered to drive his old pickup truck had to practically carry him out of the house. Martha went along, her face a mask of exhaustion and faith. "Stay here and pray, my dear," she said, squeezing my hand before leaving. "Pray for your own good and for my grandchild's." I stayed. I walked back and forth in that silent house that now seemed too big and empty. Each minute dragged like an hour. I looked at his field through the kitchen window and could only think about what kind of bad thing could live in such a calm place. Jake returned at the end of the afternoon, alone. He seemed to have aged another 5 years. He sat in the kitchen chair with his hands on his head and told me. He said Miss Felicia, a small, wrinkled lady, barely needed to touch his father. She just observed him for a long moment while he sat drooling on the truck's bench. "That one's not alone, my son," she told Jake with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "There's something bad living in that body, something from the earth that he brought from the field with him." The healer explained that sometimes these energies attach to those who walk with a sad soul, with some weakness in the spirit, and what was with his father was old and stubborn. She said she would do a cleansing, but couldn't promise anything. Her last words to Jake were, "Pray, my son, because the root of this evil is already too deep." The cleansing she did right there with him inside the car, using a sprig of rue and some prayers Jake didn't understand, had the opposite effect. Instead of calming him, it seemed to awaken the fury of whatever inhabited him. That same night, the hell in our house doubled in size. He began to have a very high fever, a heat that seemed to radiate from his body, and the delirium returned worse, mixed with short, dry laughs that echoed through the house. That's when the smell began. At first, it was a sour odor of illness, but within hours it transformed into an unbearable stench, a smell of rot, of flesh decomposing in the sun. The smell came from his pores, from his breath, impregnated the sheets, the curtains, our clothes. Martha lit incense, sprayed water with lavender, opened all the windows, but it was useless. The smell of death was everywhere and seemed to come from Earl himself. 2 days later, with the house plunged into this nightmare, Jake gave me an ultimatum. He entered our room, his eyes red from crying and not sleeping. "Sarah, you need to leave here. Miss Felicia warned that all this energy is bad for you, but it's especially bad for the baby. Please pack your things. I'll take you to your mother's house." I argued, said I wouldn't leave him alone in the middle of that. But then I looked at his face, at the desperation of a son watching his father being devoured alive, and I understood it wasn't a request. It was the only thing he still felt he could protect in that house. At my mother's house, the world seemed normal, but it was a lie. My body was there, but my mind didn't leave the ranch. Jake called me every night, his voice getting thinner and more tired each time. "He doesn't eat anything anymore," he told me in one of the last calls. "He's becoming just bone and skin. The smell, Sarah, the smell is getting worse." I hung up the phone and cried silently, hugging my belly, feeling my father-in-law wither away in the distance, consumed from the inside out. 2 weeks after I went to my mother's house, the phone rang in the middle of the night. I answered with my heart in my hand. It was Jake, his voice strangely calm on the other end of the line, empty. "It's over, Sarah," he said, and I needed a second to understand. Dad rested. He told me later, more calmly, that Earl's body had simply stopped, gave up. The fever disappeared, the smell went away, and he simply left. The strangest thing, according to Jake, was that Miss Felicia appeared at the ranch in the morning without anyone calling her. She assured them that my father-in-law's soul was finally at peace. What was with him didn't take him along, the healer told a crying Martha. It just consumed the house where his soul lived. His soul is clean now. Those words brought a strange, bitter comfort. I hung up the phone and sat on the bed in the darkness of my mother's house and cried, not for the monster he had become, but for the man he once was. The serious man from the ranch, who returned from the field with his hands dirty with earth, and who made a strange mobile that, in his way, was a gift for my son who was about to arrive. In the middle of my sadness, I felt the baby move in my belly, a gentle kick, as if reminding me that life, one way or another, needed to continue. Today my son Lucas is 4 years old. We never returned to live on that ranch. As soon as I could, I pooled my money with Jake's and we bought a simple house in town, close to my mother. On the outside, life returned to normal. Martha is a doting grandmother who fills her grandson with sweets every weekend. We miss him, but we don't talk about it. We almost never talk about those months of horror. Earl's field was left as inheritance to Lucas. That's what the document at the registry office says. But I never set foot there again. Sometimes Jake goes with his mother so the place doesn't fall into abandonment. I can't. For me, that piece of land still has the smell of that rot. Last night I was in the kitchen finishing dinner. Lucas was playing on the living room rug with some toy cars. There was a good silence in the house, just the hiss of the pressure cooker on the stove. That's when I heard him. He was singing, humming a low melody just for himself while pushing a plastic tractor across the floor. My whole body contracted. The knife I was using to cut an onion fell from my hand and hit the floor with a loud metallic sound. It wasn't a cartoon song or one of those nursery rhymes. It was the same tune, the same dissonant melody without rhythm or sense that I used to hear Earl murmur in the early morning hours, sitting on the dark living room couch. The same tune, note for note. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, looking at my son. He continued playing, smiling, completely innocent, not noticing the terror on his mother's face. I want to believe what Miss Felicia said, that my father-in-law's soul is at peace. But now every night, one question torments me before I sleep. The darkness that lived with him, where did it go when the house it occupied turned to dust? Sometimes we think we've buried the past, but there are inheritances that don't come written on paper. And I have a terrible fear that the worst of them has just learned to sing. Good evening, Dom. My name is Marcus, and I was 21 years old when everything started to fall apart. What happened to us was something that came from within, born in the gaze of others. We lived in a small town, one of those forgotten places dozens of miles from the nearest city. A main street of worn asphalt and 5 or 6 dirt side streets. My family had always lived there. My father, Joe, and I ran a small general store in front of our house, a little shop that sold everything from kerosene to fresh bread. My mother, Linda, took care of the house and me and my younger brother, Vincent, who was about 17 at the time. Our life was the usual one, no luxury at all. We lived on that edge, the one where a flat tire or a heavy rain that damages the roof becomes the month's problem. I watched my parents aging behind the counter of that store, their skin marked by time, and something began to grow inside me, an urgency to change that. I wanted to give them a little breathing room, that's all. That's why I tried so hard. I stopped helping at the store, and after much insistence, got a job as a driver for a small transport company that served some larger farms in the region. The salary wasn't a fortune, but for our standard, it was good money. For the first time in our lives, we had something left over at the end of the month. The first thing I did was buy new roofing for the store, which was always leaking. Then I replaced my mother's stove, which was about 20 years old and only worked with prayer. I remember her face, a smile I hadn't seen in a long time. Within a few months, with the little money I had saved, I bought a used motorcycle, nothing fancy, a 125 all scratched up. But it took me to and from work without having to depend on the bus. For me, that was the greatest achievement in the world. For us, it was as if life was finally starting to work out. Little did I know, it was exactly the opposite. At first, you don't notice, or maybe you pretend not to notice. The change is subtle. The neighbor who always asked my mother for a cup of sugar stopped showing up. People who used to sit on the sidewalk to chat would change the subject, or go quiet when I passed by on the motorcycle, coming back from work. Small things you ignore. My father said it was my imagination. It's people who have nothing to do, Marcus. Let them talk, he'd say with that voice of someone who's seen everything. But I could see he felt it too. Sales at the store decreased. People who had bought on credit for years started going to the store on the other side of town, even though it was more expensive. They didn't say why, they just stopped coming. Things started becoming clearer to me on a Sunday. I went to the bakery, the only one in our neighborhood, to buy bread. I had always been welcomed with, "Hey, Marcus, how's it going?" But that day, the owner barely looked at my face, gave me change in silence with his head down. On the way back, I passed a group of men on the corner and heard one of them whisper, "There he goes, thinking he's the king of the world now." I pretended not to hear, but it destroyed me. What had I done worked. Then came the little things. One day I came home and the front gate was all scratched, as if someone had dragged a key or nail across it with great force. Another night, they threw garbage in our yard, bags of food scraps, rotten things. My brother Vincent was outraged, wanted to go demand satisfaction, but from whom? There was no face, no name. It was just the air that had become heavy. My mother was the one who felt it most. She, who had always been one to chat, to say good morning to everyone, began to close herself off. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked one night, seeing her quiet on the couch. "Mrs. Anderson turned her face away from me on the street today, son," she said without looking at me, her voice very low. She pretended she didn't see me. There was nothing to say. I could only think that somehow the fault was mine. It was my job, my motorcycle, the new roof tiles. Each little thing I brought into the house seemed to build a higher wall outside. We were closing ourselves in our corner. And then the heavy air from outside seemed to leak inside the house. The first to really feel it was my mother. It started with a headache that wouldn't go away, a nagging pain that kept throbbing at the back of her neck all day. My father said it was high blood pressure, that she needed to calm down, but she was calm even too much. A week later, she woke up complaining of weakness in her hands. She tried to hold a cup, and her fingers had no firmness. She dropped a plate on the kitchen floor and stood looking at the pieces, paralyzed, as if she didn't understand what had happened. Her gaze began to become distant, somewhat glazed. We took her to the health clinic that served once a week. The doctor, a young man who seemed to be there just to fulfill his obligation, barely examined her. He said it was stress, age-related, and prescribed some pills for anxiety. He said women near 50 felt these things. My mother took everything properly, but the medicine seemed like water. She began to lose weight, and it wasn't little. Her face became gaunt, sunken, with dark circles that looked like 2 charcoal stains. The strangest thing was that she ate, we forced her to, but the food seemed not to nourish. It was like watching a plant dry from the inside out, even with moist soil. We went back to the doctor. This time he ordered some blood tests. The result took an eternity to arrive, and when it did, it said nothing. Everything was normal: glucose, cholesterol, everything within normal ranges. I don't know what it could be, the doctor said, shrugging. Could it be something with the nerves? That phrase destroyed us. Could be, nobody knew. And while nobody knew, my mother was fading away. She sat in the rocking chair in the living room. Sometimes she said she smelled something burning, a smell of dry leaves catching fire, but there was nothing. Only she smelled it. The house that had always been our refuge was becoming a strange place. The night's silence no longer brought rest, just a bad expectation, a certainty that this was just the beginning. And it was. When we thought it couldn't get worse, the curse showed it had much more strength, and it changed targets. It left my mother withering in silence and jumped with everything onto my brother. Vincent was 17, lived playing soccer on the dirt field, had never had anything more serious than a cold. It started with a stomachache, a strong cramp that made him double over. We thought it was something he ate, some nonsense. My mother made tea, gave him medicine, but the pain only increased. That night he started vomiting and didn't stop. The next day the fever came, a high fever of almost 104 degrees that wouldn't break with anything. We rushed him to the hospital in the neighboring town, the same one where my mother had done her tests. They admitted him immediately. The initial diagnosis was a severe virus, maybe an intestinal infection, but the days passed and Vincent only got worse. I'll never forget the image of him in that hospital bed. In 1 week he lost more than 20 pounds. His cheekbones began to show. His skin took on a grayish, almost transparent tone. The diarrhea gave no respite, and the doctors couldn't find the cause. They gave him IV fluids, antibiotics, but it was like trying to fill a punctured bucket. His body didn't react. My father spent nights there in a plastic chair beside the bed. I'd go after work and stay looking at my brother. His gaze was no longer there. It was lost on the ceiling, absent. Sometimes he'd mumble senseless things. In the second week, he could barely speak, just moaned softly. The doctors called us to talk. They said it was a generalized infection, that they didn't know what else to do. He died on a Tuesday morning. The report said it was multiple organ failure, an explanation that explained nothing. The wake was in our living room. And the most painful thing was that the house, which had been empty for months, filled up again. The neighbors who turned their faces away, the bakery owner, everyone showed up. They sat on the benches we borrowed, took the little cups of coffee with bread and butter that my aunt served, and talked quietly. Some even dared a corner of the mouth smile. They talked about the weather, about the harvest, as if they were in line at the store. I stayed in a corner near the kitchen door, just watching. I saw their faces, their mouths moving, and I didn't feel sadness. I felt a cold rage, a clarity that was frightening. It was them. Somehow, it was them. This wasn't a condolence visit, it was a celebration. They had come to make sure one of us had fallen. After my brother's burial, the house plunged into a silence that hurt more than any scream. My mother no longer left her room. My father aged 10 years in 2 weeks. He walked around the house like a ghost, his gaze lost, mechanical. We didn't talk about what happened, but the certainty was there in the air. That hadn't been a disease. It was an uncle of mine, my grandmother's brother, who appeared a few days later. He lived in another town and found out about Vincent's death. When he saw my mother's condition, sitting on the edge of the bed, her body tiny under the sheet, he stayed silent for a long time. Then he called my father to talk outside. I went after them. "Joe, forgive my frankness," he said, his voice grave, "but this isn't a doctor's thing. Linda is giving up, and the boy's death, this wasn't natural." My father just nodded his head, without strength to agree or disagree. "There's a lady near where I live," my uncle continued. "Her name is Fatima. She's a healer from the old days. She sees things we don't see. If you want, I'll take you there. It can't get worse than it is." The next day we went, my father and I, with my mother in the back seat wrapped in a blanket. Fatima's house was simple, with a well-kept garden in front and a strong smell of herbs and burning candles coming from inside. She was a small lady with white hair pulled back in a bun and a gaze that seemed to go right through you. She didn't ask many questions. She asked my mother to sit in a wooden chair, took a white egg, and began to pass it over her body, praying things I didn't understand. When she finished, she broke the egg into a glass of water. The yolk was dark, almost black, and the white was full of threads and some bubbles that looked like eyes. "They did evil to your woman, Joe," she said with a frightening calm. "Something made with her clothes, buried with a dead animal to suck the life out. It was done out of envy, out of the evil eye of someone who can't stand to see another go up a step." She looked at me. The evil was so great it splashed onto the boy. He was young, didn't have his body closed. He was taken in her place. My father broke down crying right there, a dry, choked cry. Fatima told us to look around the house, in some dirty place near where my mother hung clothes. That same afternoon, my father and I went with a hoe to the vacant lot behind our house. We turned over the weeds for almost an hour until the hoe hit something soft. It was a burlap sack tied with string. With the tip of the tool, my father tore the cloth. Inside was a rag doll stuck all over with rusty nails, and wrapped around it was a piece of a blue blouse my mother loved. Following the healer's orders, we burned that thing in the yard with alcohol and coarse salt. The smoke that rose was black and smelled like rotten meat. That night, for the first time in months, my mother was able to have dinner at the table with us. A small, fragile, and stupid hope began to be born in me. That hope lasted exactly 1 month. 31 days of fragile, almost artificial peace. My mother got a little color back in her face, even started taking care of the backyard garden again. My father smiled a few times. We avoided talking about Vincent, but the grief seemed to have transformed into a painful longing, no longer constant terror. We lowered our guard, and that's when the thing came back, and this time it came for me. It started as tiredness, a heavy tiredness that wouldn't pass. No matter how many hours I slept, I'd come home from work and just want to throw myself on the bed. Then came a pressure in my chest, right in the middle of my sternum, as if someone was sitting on top of me. At night I'd wake up drenched in sweat, cold sweat even in the heat. My father said it was my body feeling the shock of everything we'd been through. My mother, with her voice still weak, asked me to eat properly. They wanted to believe it was something normal, and for a while I did too. I thought it was my head, the grief, the guilt I felt gnawing inside. But then things got worse. I began to hear things. First they were whispers, hissing sounds I couldn't decipher that seemed to come from inside my bedroom wall. Then I'd hear my name, Marcus, a low, dragging voice that called me when no one was home. I'd search everywhere and find nothing. The nightmares became my routine. I'd dream I was in a dark place with cold water up to my knees and small, cold hands pulling me down. In another dream, I'd see Vincent, my brother, standing at our front gate. He wouldn't say anything, just look at me with his eyes full of dirt, as if he blamed me for something. I woke up with my heart racing, afraid to go back to sleep. I started being afraid to stay home, but it was just me. One day I came home, and the door to my room, which I was sure I had left closed, was wide open. My clothes that were folded on the chair were thrown on the floor. "Who went through my things?" I asked, my voice already altered. My father and mother looked at each other, confused. It hadn't been anyone. The fear of going crazy was almost as bad as the fear of what was happening. I was becoming an irritated, suspicious person. I lived looking over my shoulder. I started seeing shadows in the corner of my eye, especially in the hallway that led to my room. A tall, thin, dark stain that disappeared when I blinked harder. The last straw was one early morning. I woke up to the sound of glass breaking. I jumped up. The glass I always left on the nightstand beside my bed was shattered on the floor on the other side of the room. There was no way it could have fallen there. It was as if someone had thrown it against the wall. The next morning, my father put me in the car in silence and drove to Fatima's house. I didn't need to say anything. As soon as she saw me, with deep dark circles and my body shaking, she sighed. "They couldn't take your mother, boy," she said, sitting me in the same chair my mother had used. "Now they want you. It was you who lit the light in this house with your effort, and it's your light they want to extinguish." Fatima handed me a small leather pouch with some dried leaves inside and a cross made from a rue branch. "You're going to wear this around your neck. Don't take it off for anything, not even to shower," she ordered, her gaze hard. "But this is just a shield. It won't pull the evil out by the root. For that, we need to know where it comes from. Who waters this plant?" She turned to my parents. "This anger is old. It's inherited envy of life, of seeing another son succeed. Pull from memory, who in the family always looked askance at you? Who visited this house, and after the visit things started going wrong?" My father was silent, trying to think, but it was my mother who reacted. She slowly raised her head, her eyes filling with frightening understanding. "There's Claire," she whispered, "my stepmother's sister, my step-aunt." It had been years since we'd seen her. She lived in another county, and according to my mother, she'd always held a grudge because of the house my grandfather left to her. That property, however simple, was the only asset my grandmother's family had, and Claire never got over not having gotten it. She came here, my mother continued, her voice trembling. It's been about 3 or 4 years. She said she was passing through, just came to say hi. She stayed less than half an hour, but it was after that that the store started doing badly, that the small plagues appeared. Fatima nodded her head as if confirming. She left a gift for you. Look inside the house, in a dark place that doesn't move, that keeps old things, behind a wardrobe under a loose board. We turned the house upside down. At the end of the afternoon, my father, while dragging the heavy wardrobe from their room, found stuck to the wood in the back a small package, a little gray cloth bag tied with black thread. With the tip of a knife, my father cut the thread. Inside was a clump of hair that was certainly my mother's, a handful of cemetery dirt, and a yellowed tooth that looked like it was from an animal. That same night, Fatima took us to a dirt crossroads far from any house. She made a circle on the ground with salt and told me to stay inside. She put the little package in the middle, poured a bottle of rum over it, and set it on fire. The flames rose high with a sickly blue color, and the smoke had the same burning smell my mother felt. While the fire burned, I felt a pain in my stomach, a stab so strong it doubled me over. My chest burned, air wouldn't enter my lungs. I fell to my knees and began to twist in a violent fit, and I vomited on the dirt floor. It wasn't food, it was a dark liquid, almost black, thick like tar, and the smell that rose was of iron and old, rotten meat. I stayed there shaking without strength while the fire consumed the rest. When the flames went out, the pain was gone. All that was left was an emptiness, a weakness that seemed to have taken all my energy with it. "It's over," said Fatima, helping me get up. "The bond was broken, but what was lost doesn't come back. Evil doesn't erase itself, son. You just learn to live with its scar." We didn't wait another week. There was nothing left for us in that place. The house was poisoned with memories, the streets with stares. My father sold the store and what little was inside for a pittance. We gathered our clothes, the furniture we could carry in a freight truck, and left one early morning without saying goodbye to anyone. Today we live in a bigger town, hundreds of miles away, a place where no one knows us, where we're just another family trying to pay the bills. I work in a mechanic shop. My father got a job as a security guard in a parking lot. My mother was never the same. The leg pains come and go, but she's alive. We're all alive, and for a long time I thought that was enough. But Dom, I'm writing to you today because last week something happened. It was about 2 in the morning. I was in the living room, couldn't sleep, and I heard a noise at the front window. It wasn't a loud knock or the wind. It was 3 light, spaced taps, as if someone was gently knocking with the tip of a single finger. I froze. I stood there for a full minute without breathing. I went to the window and looked through the crack in the curtain. The street was empty, silent. There was no one there. The next day, however, while cleaning the glass, I noticed a thin mark on the outside, a solitary scratch at the exact height where the taps had sounded. Since then, I don't sleep well, because what terrifies me isn't the memory of what we lived through, it's the certainty. The certainty that the evil that envy awakened is still out there, hunting us in silence, just waiting for the right moment to knock on the window again. And this time, maybe we won't have anywhere to run. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.